Welcome back to our Obscure and Unsolved Mysteries Iceberg series. If you're new, a link to the previous Iceberg compilation featuring tiers 1 through 4 will be provided in the description, as well as a link to the iceberg chart itself so that you can follow along. As always, I would like to give a special shout out to our channel members. You can also become a member by clicking the join button or by making sure you're subscribed. But enough of that, we will now begin our descent of the Obscure and Unsolved Mysteries Iceberg. There is a protected county in southern Wales that had been the location of some very interesting UFO sightings in the late 1970s. To be more specific, the time of major activity started in February of 1977. And it begins with the Broadhaven Primary School, where a group of children ranging from 10 to 12 years old witnessed what they described as a silvery cigar-shaped object amongst the trees. Some of the children were understandably frightened, and so they ran inside to get the teacher's attention. But when the teachers came outside to check, the object was gone. According to various sources, initially the teachers did not believe the children. It wasn't until the children went home and told their families about it that the claims were taken more seriously. It was the headmaster of the school, Ralph Llewellyn, who separated each of the students and, in a testing-style manner, had each of them individually draw what they saw to him. To his surprise, all of the drawings that the children provided were shockingly similar. They all featured a silver disc with a round dome in the center, and some even featured beings. This event was eerily similar to the Zimbabwe aerial school encounter from September of 1994, where around 60 students at the aerial school reported an encounter with a similar silver object. Only this time, the beings who inhabited said object came out and actually communicated with the children, telling them about the environment and technology through telepathic communication, this being one of the most famous encounters with extraterrestrial beings. But our encounter at Broadhaven was not the only event to occur in Dyfed during this time. The Combs family, who lived not too far from the Broadhaven school, reported multiple encounters with strange 7-foot-tall beings, but their experiences seemed targeted and spanned over a large period of time. They worked at the Ripperston farm, a location that is now famous for the book The Uninvited, which tells the true story of the family's experiences throughout 1977. The Combs family consisted of Billy, Pauline, and their children, and it started when Pauline reportedly witnessed the ball of light floating in the sky while on the farm. What came next was a series of events that practically drove the family insane. In the time after Pauline's first sighting, the Combs family began having difficulties with their electronic equipment. Light bulbs were bursting, home appliances and farm equipment would blow fuses repeatedly, and despite many attempts to repair the electric problems happening in the home, nobody could find what was causing the problems. There was one instance in which Pauline and some of the children were driving home, when all of a sudden, one of the kids saw what they described as a glowing ball of light. Frightened by this, Pauline began driving faster in an effort to evade this object, but it turned around and followed them until the engine of Pauline's car suddenly died, only a short distance from their home. This was when her and the children ran inside to get Billy, but when Billy came outside to check on the object, it flew over their home and disappeared, leaving everybody terrified. One of the Combs daughters even claimed that a dark figure would walk around their home at night, going from room to room. But one of their most notable experiences happened on a night that Pauline and Billy were watching a movie. It was Pauline that first noticed bright lights outside of their window. At first, she tried to ignore it, but when Billy noticed, he got up and went to check on the window. This is where the couple saw what they described as a very large being wearing a silver suit of some sort and a helmet with a dark-tinted visor. According to them, this being had to be around 7 feet tall, and at the same time, the electric devices inside of the home began acting up again. Billy sent Pauline to go check on the kids while he called for help, but when help arrived, the being was not anywhere to be found. only large footprints left outside of the window that it was standing in front of.
You again, Dave? Oh, golly, your hands are cold, lad.
Yeah,
Well, anyway, these people are interested in your experience.
Yeah.
Mrs. Coombs has seen things disappear into St. Bride's Bay and watched flying silver and orange balls pass her farm.
And then after that came the silver-suited man, which was the most terrifying experience of it all.
Where did he appear?
In my window, but there were those people standing now. Excuse me. He was about 7 feet tall, and the width of the window, which is 3 feet wide, and he was there for about 2 hours.
And this was not the only sighting like this. In the coming weeks, the family had more encounters. Cows on the farm would suddenly disappear and reappear in strange locations. The Combs children had even claimed that they had seen a figure dressed in silver while out playing in a nearby field. Things like this happened so frequently to the Combs family that they were starting to lose sleep, and it was becoming clear that this was not going to stop until whatever was doing it was finished. After some time, the family began getting visits from strange men dressed in black suits, described as having very unnatural and unsettling features. These men would always come to the home looking for Pauline, but she had managed to avoid them through what seems like sheer luck. They would, however, scare the Combs children with their visits, causing them to live in more fear than they already were. And finally, one night Pauline reported having a very strange dream, where she was transported somewhere and found herself inside of a dome-like room, on a table, with a very large screen in front of her. When she woke up, she noticed that she had a small mark on her, similar to those found on those who claimed to have been abducted. This experience seemed to be the climax, because after this, the activity that was tormenting the family for now a total of 11 months came to an end. But the emotional and mental scars left on the family would last forever. Another encounter happened at the Havenfort Hotel. The owner, Mrs. Rose Granville, was doing her nightly duties when she looked out the window and spotted a large dome-shaped object outside, as well as 2 humanoid beings wearing strange suits with black visors, similar to what Pauline had described. Frightened by this, Mrs. Granville left to go find help, but when she returned, the object and the beings had already disappeared. There was also Mark Morstan, who reported to have had a face-to-face encounter with one of these beings. Mark was walking near his home when he saw a glowing object on a ridge close by. At the same time, he began to hear some rustling and turned to look at a hedge where the sound was coming from. This is when a 7-foot-tall being, wearing a helmet with a black visor, stepped out from the hedge and began walking towards him. Frightened by this, Mark ran away, but returned the next day with his father, where they discovered a large footprint that they stated to have been too big to be made by a normal person. Of course, there is no evidence of any of these things happening during that time, and while we do have various interviews from first and second-hand witnesses, we have to take all of this information with a bit of skepticism. Whether you believe in extraterrestrial life or not, the amount of reports that happened in the area during this time is not something to just brush off. Despite it being in different parts of Wales, most of the residents seemed to have reported the same 7-foot-tall beings, with helmets that looked like black visors. And with all of these similarities, it really makes you wonder just what was going on in the Dyfed Triangle in 1977. The chopper ghost incident comes from Germany in 1981. The story goes that a local dentist office in the city of Neutrubling, ran by Dr. Bastietz, his wife, and their assistant Claudia, began receiving calls from an unknown individual with a very raspy voice. It called itself Chopper. Chopper would frequently call and insult the dentist and his wife, but they would not insult Claudia. Chopper was actually very nice to Claudia, and apparently took a liking to her, though eventually, the calls would become more and more frequent, causing stress and making it difficult to run the dental practice without being constantly harassed by these phone calls. It even got to the point that they had to get the phone lines looked at and installed a call interception circuit. This seemed to stop the calls for a short time, but eventually, the calls resumed, and this time, Chopper's voice would even interrupt outgoing calls with patients. This caused Dr. Batsietz to have the phone lines looked again, and with the help of technicians, replaced many of them with new ones, though despite efforts, nobody was able to find the source that allowed Chopper's voice to intercept the phone calls. The calls would continue and escalate until Chopper threatened to take Claudia's life. This prompted the doctor to contact the police, who went around the neighborhood and interviewed potential suspects. They did end up focusing on one neighbor who had had a surgery that made his voice particularly raspy, but no real evidence was found that could tie him to the calls, and once again, it was left a mystery. But this is when the voice started being heard from inside the dental office as well. It was heard coming out of sinks, power outlets, and even a toilet. By now, the patients were beginning to get harassed while getting procedures done. Word began to spread, and eventually, everybody wanted to know about the ghost named Chopper. Journalists flocked to the dental office, and many of them were focused on Claudia, the girl who the ghost was seemingly in love with. She was now the center of attention, and according to reports, it appeared as though she was basking in the spotlight. But the police were still not finished investigating the situation. They had formed a specialized unit named Sokogeist, whose task was to investigate the alleged ghost activity happening around Claudia. The Sokogeist unit took special interest in Claudia, since she had clearly been enjoying the attention she was receiving. They found this a bit suspicious. They also noted that the activity seemed to happen primarily when she was in the room or nearby.
Chopper, warum legst du halt nichts? Ja. Chopper? Chopper, hast du jetzt gehört, was wir jetzt geredet haben gerade vorhin?
Alles gehört.
Alles gehört, so. Naja, warum sagst du jetzt nichts? Chopper.
Gleich hier allein.
Ja.
It's in this video that the investigators noted how Chopper's voice only appeared when Claudia had her back turned towards the investigators, prompting one of them to position himself at an angle where he could see Claudia's face more clearly in the reflection of the mirror in front of her. This is where they saw her lips move whenever the Chopper voice manifested itself. Following this discovery, the doctor, his wife, and Claudia were all arrested, where they admitted to have made up the whole situation, using the room's special acoustic characteristics to make the voice sound as if it was happening somewhere else. The three were fined, but the story does not necessarily end there. After the court ruling was finished, the doctor and his wife admitted themselves into a psychiatric hospital as a result of the stress and pressure that came after they were found guilty of faking these events. Though it is also reported that the doctor stated he had only partially admitted to faking the voice. While he did fake the Chopper voice on many occasions, he was not the only one, and Claudia would say the same. They both appeared to be implying that there was a third source of the Chopper voice. Claudia stated that initially, the voice was done from a third party, and that this is what kicked off them imitating the voice themselves. Who this third party was has never been revealed. I would assume that maybe the wife was the third, as it makes the most sense, but I was unable to find anything solid to support this theory. Claudia eventually went into hiding, and even changed her name as a result of the backlash they had all received. There are some that believe that the original Chopper voice could have actually been a poltergeist, and that the times that Claudia and the doctor did the voice themselves, it was actually some form of possession, but obviously there is no evidence to back this up, ultimately labeling the mystery as a hoax. But who knows? Claudia would be around 43 years old at the time of this recording, meaning that there is a chance she could come out of hiding one day and tell us the whole truth about the Chopper ghost. Marcia Moore was born on May 22, 1928, to mother Eleanor Moore and father Robert Moore. Eleanor was an artist and Robert was the founder of the Sheraton hotel chain. Alongside Marcia were her three brothers, Robert Jr., William, and John. Out of the four children, Marcia only seemed to be the black sheep. She was into things like spiritual energy, astrology, and reincarnation. Being from a very affluent and conservative family, Marcia only stood out from the rest. And in her life, she had also been married a total number of 4 times, something that her family was reportedly not too pleased about. Her first husband was a man named Simmons Roof. He was an author, and together they had 3 children. Eventually, Marcia and Simmons relocated to India and lived there for over a year, where they studied yoga and the esoteric religions. Though after returning to the US, the two divorced in 1962, leading to her second marriage with Louis Acker. This marriage would only last 3 years. Her third husband was a man named Mark Douglas that she had met very quickly after her divorce with Louis. But Mark was very controlling and abusive to Marcia. He would try to control her finances and at one point physically assaulted her, resulting in Marcia leaving him, but not before he practically stole over $100,000 from her as well as the properties that they owned. After this divorce, Marcia relocated to California, where she began experimenting with hallucinogenic drugs like LSD, but she was particularly fond of ketamine, which is known for being a party drug, but also known to have many therapeutic uses. Marcia seemed to enjoy both aspects of this substance, and when she met her fourth husband, a man named Howard Altonian, who was a doctor and could easily acquire ketamine, that Marcia began to frequently use and experiment with the substance. At one point, she was openly injecting the drug into her body, whether this was just at home or on vacation with her family. Her drug usage was well known. Ketamine was not only a huge part of Marcia's physical life, but it also had a major contribution to her spiritual beliefs. She even wrote multiple books about astrology, reincarnation, and of course, ketamine. Marcia believed that the drug helped her access multiple past lives. She felt that ketamine was a goddess, and it held the key to true enlightenment. And while this did worry her family, it did not stop her from attempting to dematerialize into her spiritual self. So when she suddenly disappeared in January of 1979, there were many who believed that she may have actually achieved dematerialization. At first, her husband Howard assumed that she had been somewhere nearby, likely doing ketamine, as this wasn't abnormal behavior of her, so he did not contact the police to report her missing right away. But when she did not reappear for some time, Howard was left with no other choice but to contact the authorities. During the investigation, Howard had informed detectives that Marcia had threatened to harm herself and that she may be experiencing mental disorders as a result of her frequent ketamine use. And soon, a search for her began, but unfortunately, the search would yield no results. It was reported in this article from the New York Post that Marcia's family lacked the passion to find her. A quote from Marcia's niece Elizabeth reads, "I can recall my uncle, who was the executor of her estate, talking to my father and suspecting that it was the husband who killed her. There was concern, but no rage. There wasn't enough passion to find out the truth. They were all gentlemen, and they took care of business." Painting us a picture of the possible reaction that the family had. And despite complications from the search, Marcia's disappearance was also sensationalized because of her spiritual beliefs, which did not help in locating her at all. At one point, the police even hired local psychics in an effort to find her, though they were also unsuccessful. When Marcia's friends heard about Howard's claims of her being depressed and manic, they were pretty upset. This was not the fun-loving and happy Marcia that they all knew. But despite this, Howard managed to avoid any real suspicion until he passed away in 2006. During all of this, Howard even stated that he was going to be abstinent now that he had lost Marcia, but reportedly started dating around not long after. Police even investigated him in a series of rapes, but he was never charged with them or Marcia's disappearance. And it wasn't until 2 years after she had originally vanished that human remains were found about 2 miles from her home. It was a piece of her skull, and it provided dental records that confirmed that these remains belonged to Marcia. But this is where the mystery gets a little bit deeper. There was a hole found on Marcia's skull fragment, but examiners determined that she had climbed up into a tree, injected herself with a large dose of ketamine, and ultimately fell victim to hypothermia. Investigators believed that the hole must have happened due to the bone's exposure to the elements, but this has been debated by many who believe that Howard had something to do with it. hinting that the hole could be a bullet hole. Unfortunately, in the end, nobody was able to figure out what truly happened to Marcia. But if you ask me, I think it is very possible that Marcia could have walked into the forest to do ketamine and accidentally did too much. And maybe if Howard did have something to do with this, he could have given her a larger than normal dose, leading to her death. I believe if he did want to take her life, that this would be a safer option for him than to use a gun. But this is just my own speculation. We'll likely never know what happened to her, but maybe next time you pass by one of the Sheridan hotels, you might stop and think about Marcia. There is an ancient codex that was found in early 1800s Hungary and has not been deciphered to this day. It's called the Rohonc Codex. The codex was originally part of Count Gustav Spatiani's personal library, and it wasn't until he donated his entire collection of books to the Hungarian Academy of Sciences that scholars stumbled upon it. The codex contains a total of 448 pages. However, each of them is unreadable. It is believed that the language could be either ancient Hindi or ancient Hungarian, but there are also a large amount of symbols used in the text that are not in any other written language. In fact, it's reported that the codex contains around 10 times as many symbols as any other written language. Researchers believe that the book could have been created sometime around the 16th and 17th centuries, due to it being printed on Venetian paper that dates back to that era. The paper is even watermarked with the symbol of an anchor inside of a circle and a star on top. But alongside its unreadable texts, there are also various drawings depicting religious events, from religions including Christianity, Hinduism, and Islam. There also appears to be depictions of wars. Some of the images appear to directly reference the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, and the codex was also believed to be under a catalog entry in Count Gustav's library that read, Hungarian prayers in one volume, size duodecimo, adding more to the theory that the codex is some form of religious text. Though despite many scholars looking at this book throughout the years, nobody has been able to decipher it. In 2015, the book was moved to the Hamburg University, where it has been studied and even rescanned to provide some better images of some of the pages. There are some researchers today that believe the entire book is some form of ancient hoax, though others believe that the book tells the story of Jesus Christ as well as other religions and historical events. The codex is interesting to say the least, and whether it's an ancient fake or not, somebody put real effort into making that book, and somehow it managed to last around 400 years, all while keeping the secrets inside hidden. At 5:41 on the day of August 2nd, 1947, Chilean air tower operators from Los Cerrillos Airport received a strange message from a plane informing them that the aircraft would be landing in the next 4 minutes. The message sent in Morse code read, ETA, Santiago, 1745 hours, Stendec. Airport personnel began to get ready for the aircraft's landing, but the word Stendec confused them. They had never heard this word before, and so they asked the pilot to clarify on the last bit of the message. But the message they got back was simply the word Stendec, repeated back 2 times. And that was not the only weird thing, because the plane never arrived. It appeared as though it had simply vanished into thin air. A search for the plane began and lasted around 5 days. Since the message from the plane stated that they were going to land in 4 minutes, search teams rightfully assumed that the plane would be somewhere near the area, but despite all efforts, there was zero trace of the plane anywhere to be found. The plane was an Avro Lancastrian named Stardust, registered as G-AGWH. It was piloted by a man named Captain Reginald J. Cook and his crew, Norman Hilton Cook, Donald L. Checklin, Dennis B. Harmer, and Iris M. Evans. As well as the crew, there were also 6 passengers on board the plane, and they had departed from Buenos Aires, heading to Santiago. Captain Cook, Norman, and Donald were all decorated and experienced pilots in the Royal Air Force. Dennis and Iris also had experience in the Royal Forces, so it's fair to say that the crew was strong, and so the flight should have gone very smoothly. But what could have caused the plane to simply disappear when they were only minutes away from landing? And what did the word Stendec mean? The crew clearly thought it was important enough to send it out multiple times in their final moments, not to mention that it was in Morse code, meaning they would have had to input every letter one at a time in order to get the message through, when they could have simply sent the message SOS, a universal distress call with only 3 letters to input. All of this puzzled the world of aviation so much that people began to speculate that the plane could have disappeared as a result of otherworldly influences. This became so popular, in fact, that UFO magazine ended up adopting the name due to its growing popularity. There are many theories on the meaning of the word Stendec. Some people believe that Stendec is an anagram. If you rearrange the letters, you get the word descent, which is a very clear and normal aviation term, especially when you put it into the context of the original message. ETA, Santiago, 1745 hours, descent. But that just doesn't make sense. Firstly, this was not some secret flight that needed its messages to the tower to be encoded. And secondly, if the plane was in trouble while sending the message, why would they waste precious time to code a word when they were supposedly only 4 minutes from landing? This brings us to the theory that Stendec could have stood for Stardust Tank Empty, No Diesel, Expect Crash. But again, if you were expecting a crash, why not simply send the message SOS when time is so crucial? There is also the theory that Stendec was a Morse code typo or misinterpretation. The Morse code for Stendec is also similar to SCTI-AR, which would be the 4-letter code for Los Cerrillos Airport, and the abbreviation AR for over. This would make sense, and when you put it side by side, you can kind of see how the messages are similar. But something that I think breaks this theory is that the message would have had to been misinterpreted a total of 3 separate times. I could understand once, but 3 is a little bit much. The location of Stardust would remain hidden for around 50 years, until in 1998, mountain climbers climbing Mount Tepangado spotted what appeared to be a Rolls-Royce engine of an aircraft, alongside scattered pieces of clothing. The climbers reported this find, and an official search was conducted in 2000. There, they found scattered human remains including 3 torsos, a foot inside of a boot, and a woman's hand, all of which were well preserved due to the icy conditions. The area of the wreckage spanned for over a mile in radius, and after DNA testing, it was concluded that the remains belonged to the crew and passengers who were on board the Stardust aircraft. Looking into the crash site even further, it was determined that the plane had crashed into the mountain at such a high speed that the impact caused an avalanche that ended up covering the wreckage in snow before search teams could get to it. We can also take a look at the crash site and the airport's locations and see how close the two are from each other. But while this solved the mystery of where the craft landed, we still did not have an explanation about what Stendec meant. There are some reports that Stendec is military code that stands for Severe Turbulence, Now Descending, Emergency Crash Landing, but I was not able to verify if that is true, so if you know anything about military aviation codes, please let us know down in the comments. Personally, I think that people jumped to the alien abduction theories pretty quickly. I think a much more plausible explanation, and one I've seen floating around, is that the crew unexpectedly encountered what is known as a jet stream, which is a stream of very fast wind that occurs at high altitudes. This could have quickly disoriented the crew, causing them to crash. And since they were all military trained, if Stendec did mean severe turbulence, now descending, emergency crash landing, that could have been the reason that the crew chose to send that message. But unfortunately, since the airport crew were not military, they did not know what the code meant. But regardless, it's unlikely that they would have been able to do much from the ground. In 1982, development was happening in Florida, where one of the most, if not the most important archaeological site in North America would unexpectedly be discovered. It all started in a bog at Windover Farms, located in Brevard County, Florida, where a construction worker operating a backhoe named Steve Vanderjacht noticed something strange in his bucket. At first, he thought it was a rock, but this was odd because the area they were working in was a bog. So Steve got off and went to inspect the rock himself. When he examined it, he realized that it was not a rock. It was actually a human skull. Immediately, the project came to a halt, and the crew quickly contacted the police, having initially thought that they had stumbled upon the site of a murder. At first, the police were of no help, but after a coroner examined the bones, they concluded that they did not belong to modern humans. So the police had no real interest in investigating any further. At this point, a man named Jack Eckert and his stepson Jim Swan, who were the developers on the project, could not simply let this go. They contacted an archaeologist named Glenn Doran, who upon inspecting the remains, knew that there was much more to the discovery. With funding provided by Jim Swan, Glenn was able to get the bones radiocarbon dated, which is the method for determining the age of an object containing organic material by using the properties of radiocarbon, a radioactive isotope of carbon. Doing this, they discovered that the bones were over 7,000 years old, making them thousands of years older than the Egyptian pyramids. To put that into scale, these humans were around in the Neolithic era, or towards the end of the New Stone Age. This discovery kicked off a full excavation that required archaeologists to extract the water from the site so that they could begin searching for more remains. In total, they found skeletal remains of around 168 people, but that was not even the most shocking discovery. Each of the bodies were found in a fetal position, with their head pointing to the west, face to the north, and they all had a structure of sticks arranged in a pyramid shape, holding down a piece of fabric on top of them, that scientists believe was so that the buried person would not float up to the surface. And this seemed to have worked, because the skeletons managed to remain buried for thousands of years, but the way they were preserved also caught the archaeologists by surprise. Usually, bogs have very acidic conditions, and are low in oxygen, making them perfect for preserving mummified remains. In most cases, flesh remains on bog mummies, but that was not the case at the Windover Bog. Its pH levels were more on the neutral side, making it easier for the flesh to decompose, while also keeping the skeleton intact. Not only that, but the way that the bodies were all arranged indicated that this site must have been some sort of cemetery. Aside from the mummies, evidence of medicinal herbs and plants were found on the site, hinting that these people may have had some form of medical knowledge in treating illnesses. Some of the remains were even estimated to have been in their 70s at the time of death, meaning that these people lived relatively long lives. 91 of the skulls were found to still have brain matter inside of them. Because of this, archaeologists concluded that the bodies must have been buried within the first 48 hours of death. There were also tools made of animal bones and even a gourd container. Other clues indicated that these people were much more civilized than we had initially thought humans from that time could have been. Through their observations, archaeologists theorized that these people likely lived along the coastline during the summer season and moved inland once winter came along. This being because the cemetery showed evidence that the burials only happened in the summer, though the location that they migrated to in the winter is still unknown. DNA testing was also done on the samples of brain matter, where scientists found that the lineage could not be linked to any Native Americans living in the area during this time. According to the HistoryCenter.org website, they believe that these people must have immigrated to North America from somewhere in Asia. We are still unsure about what exactly happened to these people, but the discovery of the gravesite has uprooted a lot of what we thought we knew about people from this era. They were much more sophisticated, loving, and intelligent than we had imagined, and the Windover Bog site is evidence of that. Today, the Windover Bog is a historical landmark, and is protected with the hopes of one day returning with better archaeological technology so that we can uncover the story of just who the people from the oldest archaeological dig site in America truly were. At first glance, this beautiful $3.6 million Palm Springs home may seem like the house of your dreams. Built in 1961, It's located in one of the wealthiest areas of California, but hidden behind the walls of this house is a dark secret, because it was the location of one of the most notorious triple murders that ever occurred in that area. In 1970, Edward Friendly and his wife Sophia Friendly moved into this home. Edward had made millions from San Francisco real estate and his sale of the Bay Area Tanforan racetrack, while Sophia came from an affluent family herself, and she was stated to inherit a trust of $1 million from her previous husband, Curtis Hutton. Curtis was gifted this trust from his cousin Barbara Hutton in 1930. At the time, he was still alive, but he was suffering from cancer, and if he were to pass away, the trust was set to transfer into Sophia's name to take care of her and their children. Needless to say, the Friendlies were very well off. Edward and Sophia had also hired a part-time maid and cook by the name of Frances Williams. She was originally from Kansas and moved to California after her first husband passed away, living in an apartment nearby the Friendlies' home. In many of the articles covering the Friendlies' murders, Frances is often looked over, and sometimes not even mentioned at all, but she is part of the story, and tragically, she would fall to the same fate that Edward and Sophia did. In the early morning of October 13th in 1978, a pool cleaner that worked for the Friendly family was on his way into the backyard when suddenly he spotted the body of Frances laying in a pool of blood inside of the kitchen from one of the windows. He immediately contacted the police, and soon they would uncover a tragic scene. Inside the home, Edward, Sophia, and Frances were all found lifeless. Each of them had been shot in the head. It was believed that the killer managed to get inside of the home without much trouble, likely being let in from the front door. And the first person that he shot was Sophia. She had turned to run away, but was shot in the back of the head. Then, the killer moved into the kitchen, where he encountered Frances, who dropped down to her knees, likely begging for mercy. But those pleas would go unanswered, as the killer also shot her in the head, this time at point blank. Edward was the last to get killed. He was watching TV with the volume very loud, as he was already hard at hearing and used the hearing aid. Unfortunately, because of this, he would not notice the shots that killed Sophia and Frances, and he too would meet the same fate, being shot once in the head and one more time in the chest. What was interesting was that each of these kills was done swiftly, with only one shot per person, Edward being the exception with the second one to the chest. Investigators also noted that papers and other things were moved around the home, as if the killer was looking for something, but nothing was taken. This including $400 inside of a wallet that was left in plain view. It was also reported that the killer left a fedora on top of Sophia's face. This could have meant something more, likely that she had been the intended target. Police would also find bullet casings belonging to a .45 caliber handgun, but other than that, nothing that could identify the killer was anywhere to be found, and nobody in the neighborhood had heard any shots or noticed any strange activity. So, police had little or practically nothing to work with. It was believed that whoever did this was an experienced assassin, that the intended targets were Edward and Sophia, and that Frances was killed solely because she was a witness. Now, the only question aside from the identity of the killer was why. Well, the Friendlies were both very wealthy, but if nothing was really stolen from the home, then money would not make much sense. At least not unless somebody in the family was said to inherit a large amount of money, which brings us back to Sophia's $1 million trust. As I mentioned earlier, Sophia was due to inherit the trust after her first husband passed away, $1 million that in today's age would be the equivalent of over $8 million in total. That's not even considering potential interest growth. And Sophia did have 2 children with her first husband. Their names were Sophia and Edward Hutton. And yes, they have the same name as their mother and stepfather, in case you were also confused. Upon learning about the trust, investigators began questioning Sophia's children and ex-husband, where they found out that Sophia and her children had a somewhat strained relationship stemming from money. It's even reported that her son Edward Hutton was cut out of the will. Unfortunately, Curtis would pass away from his cancer 2 weeks after his ex-wife was murdered, and the trust was transferred to the children. This was very suspicious to investigators, and after interviewing Edward Hutton, they discovered that he had a friend named Andres Christensen, who was a criminal from Scandinavia. Andres had even met the friendlies a few weeks before the murders at a restaurant in Houston. This made Andres the primary suspect, seeing as how there was no forced entry, and this man had only recently met the friendlies. It would have been possible that he had managed to get into the friendlies' home by simply being let in. But other than a suspicion, police initially had no evidence to tie Andres to the crime, which gave him enough time to leave the US and go to Denmark. Andres was eventually charged with the killings while in Denmark, due to a treaty that allows Denmark's citizens to be charged in Copenhagen if they are suspected of a crime in the US, though the authorities in the US did not move forward with the process, and he managed to stay a free man until June 2nd, 1981. This was when Denmark police caught Andres while he was in the middle of robbing a bank. At first, he had given them a fake name, but after he was taken in and fingerprinted, his true identity was revealed. Interpol was notified of this arrest, and so investigators from the US finally went to Denmark so that they could interview Andres. During the interview, he denied killing anybody, but he did give the detectives a ton of extra information. He admitted that he had met the friendlies, and that he was in the area at the time that the murders took place. He even admitted to have previously owned the same exact gun that was used in the attack. The gun was a .45 caliber Star Model PD, a compact but powerful gun that characteristically added a unique spin to the bullets fired from it, the same exact spin that ballistic investigators found on the bullets that were fired in the friendly home. However, Andres claimed that he did not have the gun when the murders occurred, because he had broken it down and disposed of it while on a train in Germany. So, without a real admission of guilt or murder weapon, investigators went back to the US in an effort to search for something that could tie Andres to the gun, but their efforts proved fruitless. In the end, Andres was only charged with the bank robbery and sentenced to serve 6 years, though many of the police working on the case strongly believed that he was the killer, even without the weapon to prove it. Edward Hutton ended up relocating to a tourist city in Mexico and denied ever being involved with the murders. To this day, the identity of the killer was never truly confirmed. We've seen time and time again how money can turn family members against each other, sometimes leaving some to pay the ultimate price. It is not too often that a case as brutal as this is left unanswered, but unfortunately, justice is not always promised. In this day and age, it's hard not to hear about cryptocurrency. It seems like every day there's a new crypto coin, NFT, or some emerging form of digital money. But the one cryptocurrency that stands strong above all others has unequivocally got to be Bitcoin. At the time of this recording, a single Bitcoin is worth over 67,000 US dollars, and every day it seems to get more and more popular. I personally remember when it was worth cents, and some people I knew used it to purchase some products from the internet. Never would we have thought that one day the coins that were practically thrown away would be worth so much. Though despite its popularity, we do not know who the creator of Bitcoin really is. Development of Bitcoin started in 2007. The famous Bitcoin white paper was released in 2008. It explained what Bitcoin was, how it worked, and at the top of the page was the name of the author. Their name was Satoshi Nakamoto. Given the name, it has been assumed that Satoshi Nakamoto could be Japanese. We also know that Satoshi worked on Bitcoin from the beginning but stopped directly working on it in 2010. And at one point, they held around 1 million Bitcoins, skyrocketing them into being one of the richest people on the entire planet. In today's value, that would be worth over 63 billion USD, and whoever it is that controls this monumental source of wealth remains a ghost. It's believed that the name Satoshi Nakamoto is a pseudonym, similar to how authors go by a pen name. This was likely because whoever originally created Bitcoin wanted to retain anonymity, given that the creator and the original team could be targeted since they were technically in control of such a large reserve of money. This would make a lot of sense. That, or they simply wanted to avoid the media and public attention that was sure to come if their true identity was ever revealed. Over the years, there have been many people who claimed to be the creator of Bitcoin, and since Satoshi has never made a public statement other than the white paper release, Nobody has been around to truly deny these claims, but so far the true identity of Satoshi has not been officially revealed. Two notable people who claimed to be the creators were Craig Wright and Nick Szabo. Craig is an Australian scientist who was caught stating that he was running Bitcoin from as early on as 2009 in a leaked transcript. But a deeper look into his blog posts revealed that the posts where he claimed that he had created Bitcoin were all backdated to make it appear as though that they lined up with the creation of Bitcoin. In 2024, a London High Court determined that Craig was not Satoshi Nakamoto as a result of the overwhelming amount of evidence against him. Nick Szabo, on the other hand, was a computer engineer and the creator of BitGold that is described as being the precursor to Bitcoin and was launched way back in 1998, though unlike Craig, Nick never claimed to be Satoshi. This theory came from the public speculation, leaving the possibility of him being the creator open. There is one more person who people believe could have been Satoshi, or at the very least someone who had very close direct involvement with Bitcoin's creation, and that person was Steve Jobs. Steve was one of the biggest leaders in the tech industry when he was alive, so this would make a lot of sense. But it was a blog from 2023 where a man named Andy Baio stumbled upon a hidden PDF file containing the Bitcoin white paper on his Mac computer, and as it would turn out, the file was included on every Mac with the Mojave 10.14.0 OS and could be found by simply going to the terminal and inputting this command, after which you would find the famous Bitcoin white paper. This has since been patched with the release of the Ventura 13.4 OS, but the evidence of its existence lives online. Another reason that people believe Steve Jobs was Satoshi Nakamoto was because Satoshi stopped working on Bitcoin in December of 2010, and Steve Jobs passed away in October of 2011, only 10 months after Satoshi allegedly stopped being involved. We know that Steve was suffering from pancreatic cancer at the time of his death, and if his health was deteriorating in the year leading up to his passing, it would make sense that he would not be able to work on Bitcoin anymore, lining up both timelines pretty nicely. But as of the time of this recording, this is just speculation, and Apple has not fully explained why the white paper was hidden on all of these Mac devices, other than an engineer snuck it in there and it managed to stay hidden for quite some time. Something that I find very odd coming from Apple. It is very possible that Satoshi Nakamoto was not just one single creator, but a group of individuals who all worked on Bitcoin together. Though whether it was one individual or a group of people, it is very likely that everyone involved or close by had to sign NDAs to keep the identity secret, meaning that we'll likely never know, or at least have to wait a very long time to figure out who Satoshi Nakamoto really is, leaving the identity of the person or people who created the most revolutionary form of digital currency a mystery. Dana Bradley was a 14-year-old girl from Newfoundland who disappeared on December 14, 1981. It was her mother's birthday, and Dana had gone to a friend's house after school. Dana was supposed to head home so that she could celebrate with her family. The plan was to take the bus that was only a short walk from her friend's house and use it to get home. But as her family waited, Dana never showed up. Right away, her mother and stepfather noticed something was wrong and attempted to contact the police. But because it was relatively soon since she had disappeared, they did not start an official search until the next morning. The search for Dana went on for 4 long days, until a man named Del Smith, who was out with his family in the woods looking for Christmas trees, stumbled upon what he had initially thought was a mannequin. But once he got closer, Del noticed that this was not a mannequin at all. It was the body of 14-year-old Dana Bradley. The area Dana was found in was deeper into the wooded area off of Maddox Cove Road. Del had gone deeper into the woods because he believed that that's where he would find a better Christmas tree. But what he ended up finding was this missing girl. Where she was found, Dana was laid carefully on her back, as if she were already laying in a coffin. Her books from school were placed underneath her arms as if she were holding them, and her face was clean. But an autopsy revealed that she had been sexually assaulted, and that the cause of death was ruled to be blunt force trauma to the head, It was after seeing a newspaper article that investigators were contacted by two brothers named Harry and John Smeaton. Harry and John were working at a nearby lot selling Christmas trees, and at the time that Dana went missing, business was slow, so the two were reportedly in their truck watching people. This is where they stated that they had seen a girl they believed was Dana. They told investigators that when they saw her, they thought that she was going to the bus stop, but instead of going to the bus stop, she stuck out her thumb as though she were attempting to hitchhike. They found this a bit odd since she was so young, but almost immediately, a car pulled up next to her, and she got in. The brothers said that they believed the car was either a 1973 to 76 Dodge Dart or Plymouth variant. It was old, beaten, covered in dust, and the color was either beige or tan. They also reported that the passenger door did not appear to work correctly, and this forced the driver to lean over so that he could open the door for Dana to get in. Thankfully, Harry and John were parked pretty close to Dana when all of this occurred, and were able to give a good description to the investigators. Not only that, but two more witnesses came out to speak with police, basically telling them the same story. With this information, the detectives managed to draw up this sketch of the suspect. The police also managed to get a very small sample of DNA off of Dana's body, but at the time, DNA technology was not very advanced, so the sample was stored in the hopes that sometime in the future, it would help reveal the possible identity of the killer. With all of these new discoveries, investigators ended up interviewing hundreds of people and examined over 800 cars, but these efforts would not bring them any closer to solving this mystery. The story ended up gaining a lot of popularity, so much so that Dana's family started getting calls from an individual who would mock them about Dana's death. This person was charged with harassment in 1982, but it would appear that they had nothing to do with the death at all. They simply wanted to troll the family. Despite slowing down immensely, the case never went cold, and in 1986, detectives received a tip about a guy named David Somerton, and so they interrogated him, where he admitted that he had been the one that killed Dana, even telling the detectives where the location of the missing vehicle was. But David's information did not help them find any vehicle at all, and, in a strange turn of events, he would take back his confession, claiming that the police had kept him in custody for over 18 hours, prompting him to give them a false confession. With this, and the lack of evidence tying him to the case, the police had nothing. But he was charged with lying to the police and ended up receiving a 2-year sentence. Another breakthrough in the case would not happen again until 2014. This time, a man named Robert came to the police and told them that he had actually been there when Dana was abducted and killed. He stated that at the time he was very young and had repressed the memory due to the trauma, but Robert and his 4-year-old brother were allegedly in the car of a man named Thomas Carey. Thomas was a convicted pedophile, and Robert and his brother were in the back seat. The two were very young and small, so they could not be seen in the car when Edward and John had spotted the abduction. According to Robert, he and his brother were riding around with Thomas when they stumbled upon Dana, who was attempting to hitch a ride. Thomas stopped and picked her up, after which Dana gave Thomas the address, and they started driving. But Thomas did not drive towards the location of Dana's home, and when she noticed this, she began to get scared and even attempted to jump out of the moving vehicle, only to get grabbed and pulled back in by Thomas. Eventually, Thomas drove to a wooded area where he tried to assault her, but Dana fought back and tried to escape, angering Thomas, who took a tire iron and hit her on the head. After this, the three of them cleaned her up and positioned her in the way that she was found, allegedly hoping that she would just wake up and go to school sometime after. They then buried the car somewhere in Witless Bay. Police found many discrepancies in Robert's story, and as a result did not take him too seriously. But this was not the same case for the public. A group called Justice for Dana was formed on Facebook, and after police confirmed that they were not willing to spend the resources on excavating the location that Robert had told them the vehicles were in, the Facebook group began to raise the money so that they could search for the vehicles themselves. After 16 months of this, they finally had enough money to start the excavation, where they did manage to find 2 vehicles buried in the location that Robert had said, one of which even belonged to Robert's father. But neither of the vehicles were able to provide any clues due to the state that they were in after being buried for so long. And finally, in 2016, the DNA that was found on Dana was finally able to be tested, and it was concluded that the killer was not in the system. While this may not sound like a good thing at first, it gave detectives the opportunity to eliminate many suspects that were in the system, but this would include Thomas Carey. and ultimately disprove Robert's story. Dana's family never did stop searching for her, and even now, the case is not ruled as a cold case. It seems as though investigators are still trying to figure out the truth. Dana would be about 57 years old at the time of this recording, but her name has lived on by those who are still searching for answers, in the hopes of one day bringing justice to her and finally give some closure to her family and the local community. Guglielmo Marconi was an Italian inventor during the late 1800s, and is even credited as being the grandfather of Wi-Fi for his work in wireless telegraphy. Marconi was also the man who created the first truly wireless radio, and has been likened to that of the famous inventor Nikola Tesla. But one of the things he's most famous for was his concern over the creation of a death ray. During the late 1800s, scientists began researching electromagnetic waves. The idea was first theorized by a man named James Maxwell in 1867, but it wouldn't be until 20 years later that Heinrich Hertz was able to prove the theory and generate electromagnetic waves in his lab. This being a new discovery at the time meant that all kinds of new technologies could be developed with the use of these waves. But perhaps the most revolutionary technology at the time was that of the wireless radio. The exact date is not clear, but it's believed Marconi built his first radio somewhere around 1894 or 1895. Going into the early 1900s, Marconi had set up his yacht, the Elettra, to be his laboratory on the water, where he conducted many of his experiments. And it is here that Marconi would have a, quote, interesting discussion with a man named Aldelmo Landini, who was Marconi's radio operator on the Elettra. In his book, titled 5 Years on Board the Elettra with Marconi, Landini would talk about a conversation he had with Marconi himself. I am sure there must be in the middle of the frequency spectrum a frequency able to kill more or less rapidly a particular microorganism. A well-defined frequency, as many frequencies as the number of microbes, in short, enough to resolve the diseases of man, animals, and plants. While this does not outrightly speak of the death ray, we can see the fundamental idea begin to manifest. But Marconi was not the only person to conceptualize such a deadly device. English inventor Harry Grindle Matthews would go as far as to claim that he had actually invented a death ray in the 1920s. His device used electricity, but his claims were met with a lot of skepticism, despite demonstrating his device to some journalists as well as government officials. Many were suspicious that Matthews was using trickery or some sort of confidence game. Eventually, after much back and forth between multiple governments, Matthews claimed that he had sold the death ray to the United States, but would not disclose the amount he had gotten paid for it, or to who exactly, and no proof of this device's existence would ever make it into the public. Not only that, Nikola Tesla would say this in a quote from the 1937 article, "A machine to end war. None of my inventions contemplate the use of any so-called death rays. Rays are not applicable because they cannot be produced in the requisite quantities and diminish rapidly in intensity with distance. All the energy of New York City, approximately 2 million horsepower, transformed into rays and projected 20 miles, could not kill a human being, because according to a well-known law of physics, it would disperse to such an extent as to be ineffectual. My apparatus projects particles, which may be relatively large or of microscopic dimensions, enabling us to convey to a small area at a great distance trillions of times more energy than is possible with rays of any kind. Many thousands of horsepower can thus be transmitted by a stream thinner than a hair, so that nothing can resist it." Despite stating that waves cannot be used to create such a device, the outright mention of a death ray is interesting. It's clear that the idea of such a device was thought of by some of the world's greatest inventors. In the case of Nikola Tesla, despite some of his inventions being wildly imaginative, many were very real. And if we look at present-day devices such as particle accelerators, which are able to take particles and smash them together with a force strong enough to replicate the conditions that immediately followed that of the Big Bang. Tesla's particle beam death ray seems a lot more achievable. In this published article, author Carlo Artemi cites the biography of Rachelle Mussolini, wife of the Italian ruler Benito Mussolini, where she claims Marconi possessed a device with the power to paralyze aircraft and cars through the use of concentrated microwaves. I was not able to find a copy of the biography online to validate this, but I did find this newspaper article from 1935, where they talk about Marconi using microwave radiation to stop the engines of planes and cars, like Rachelle Mussolini had allegedly claimed in her book. But some believe that this claim could have potentially been propaganda used to strengthen Mussolini's rule, by making it appear as though Italy had possessed weapons far more technologically superior than the rest of the world. And Marconi not only got the attention of other scientists. In the 1930s, Pope Pius invited Marconi to the Vatican to set up the Vatican radio. Here, he also conducted many experiments using microwaves, but all of this would end in 1937, when Marconi passed away at the age of 63. It's stated that 3 days before his death, Marconi met with the Pope, though what they spoke of was never disclosed. It's also stated that a few hours before he passed away, Marconi spoke with his doctor, Dr. Pozzi, and spoke to him about, quote, some things that only you must know, which Dr. Pozzi took with him to the grave. 8 years later in the book, Mussolini Confesses to the Stars, Mussolini would claim that Marconi had proposed the death ray to him, but was advised against building it by the Pope due to the destruction it would bring. But again, the validity of this is debated on because of Mussolini's strong propaganda campaigns. In the end, no device was ever made public, but I find the Mussolini claims the most interesting. On one hand, we have newspaper articles stating that a device was already created and was even used to stop multiple types of vehicles, and on the other, we have Mussolini claiming in a book that Marconi was advised against building such a device, further muddying the water. Like Nikola Tesla, Marconi may have been way ahead of his time, and while I don't believe he had fully perfected a device such as a death ray, I believe he may have at the very least experimented with, or developed something close, that made him fearful of its completion. With where we're at with technology right now, it's very possible that such a device may already exist. Before we get into this section, I would like to warn you that we will be talking about, in YouTube terms, unaliving oneself. So, if that is something you're uncomfortable with, I understand, and you may skip ahead to the next section of the video. Let's start at the beginning. Chris McKinstry was a Canadian-born computer scientist who by age 17 had become a millionaire after creating a copyright software and licensing it to large companies, as seen in this article right here. Chris has been recognized for his work in the AI field, but despite his success, he did experience very low points. At age 23 in 1990, Chris and his then girlfriend had broken up, and he was taking it pretty hard. As reported in this documentary, The Man Behind the Curtain, Chris had gone to the hospital to tell them that he wanted to end his life, but the hospital staff did not take him seriously and sent him away to battle his demons alone. After this, he went to a local gun shop, where after asking the worker if he could check out some of the firearms, he proceeded to insert rounds of ammunition into said firearms, leading to a standoff with police. An archived Google group message contains a copy of the article sent by a user back in late January 2006. Police capture armed man. Tear gas ends a 7.5-hour standoff at downtown gun shop by Robert Steiner. Toronto. A 23-year-old armed man was captured last night by the Police Emergency Task Force after a 7.5-hour standoff at a downtown gun shop. Police sprayed the Yonge Street gun shop with tear gas and entered it wearing gas masks at 9:45 p.m. They discovered a man in the basement next to 2 loaded rifles. The man, conscious and uninjured, was taken to the hospital. He was hiding in the basement with 2 armed rifles, Staff Inspector Robert Molyneux told reporters moments after the capture. We had seen him moving around the store with weapons and a metal helmet before he disappeared from our view. During the 5 hours of negotiations, the man told police he had problems with his girlfriend and was considering suicide. The police negotiator, Staff Sergeant Terry Kelly, said he was intending to commit suicide. The man entered Nick's sports shop near Wesley Street at about 2 p.m. yesterday, where he grabbed a handgun from the shop owner. The staff and customers fled. Emergency task force officers crouched in doorways on either side of the shop. Officers working from a command post near a subway station quickly established communication with the gunman and tried to persuade him to give himself up. Later, the man's girlfriend and male friend were brought in, Detective Sergeant Lou Villani said. Shortly before 8 p.m., the man ripped out the phone cord and disappeared from view. Police said they didn't know whether he was still conscious or even alive. He could have passed out, or he could have passed away, said Staff Sergeant Mike Sale after contact with the man was lost. Time is of the essence now. We must go inside and see how he is. Before releasing tear gas, police sent a Fox robot into the store. The machine was operated by a bomb disposal unit and equipped with a video camera and stun gas. The gas would have been triggered if the robot had been attacked. After 15 minutes, when the robot found nothing on the store's first floor, police sprayed the store with tear gas and sent in emergency task force officers. Police identified the man in custody as Chris McKinstry. Such an event would be considered life-ruining by many, but not Chris. Because he had previously gone to the hospital pleading for help before the standoff, Chris was not criminally charged, and friends of his would even say that the event actually motivated him in his career. 6 years later, Chris would begin producing an internet soap opera called CR6.
CR6 is our showcase interactive clickable reality. It's a internet-based soap opera, for lack of a better term. It's actually darker than a soap opera.
According to this now deleted Redditor who did great work trying to find CR6 on the Lost Media sub, production of the show began in 1996, and Chris had put over $1 million into it. But production fell through after it was reported by crew that Chris was incredibly hard to work with. He would be described as a narcissist, bipolar, and even too smart for his own good. Chris ultimately sold the rights to CR6 for $1 to the production staff, but there were still complaints that everyone who worked on the show was left unpaid. Unfortunately for them, Chris ended up moving to Santiago, Chile, and alienating himself from almost everybody who knew him. There are even archived Google group messages from October 1999, where he defends himself from people calling him a scammer. So the story goes, McKinstry ripped off people and ended up in Chile, where he spent the last few years hiding. But he was seen by myself this past June having lunch at the Olive Garden on Portage across from Polo Park. Chris would reply with, 1. I haven't been in Canada since August 18, 1997, though I still do maintain substantial assets there. 2. I wouldn't be caught dead in an Olive Garden. 3. I've had extensive plastic surgery, so you couldn't recognize me anyways. And as for the primary question, CR6 was sold to the cast in June of 1997 for $1. They own all the rights to trademarks, story, characters, and production software. As for people getting ripped off, no one lost money, other than me, depending on how you count about 1 million, contrary to the reports here and in the media. Now, even though Chris was in Chile, he did continue to work on his AI projects. Though according to some of his colleagues, what he claimed about his projects was often exaggerated. MindPixel, for example, which launched in 2000, was portrayed to be the foundation to an AI neural network by Chris, but was at its core simply a database of true or false questions based off of the answers provided to it. Unfortunately for Chris, 5 years after the launch of MindPixel, the project came to an end. Throughout all of this time, Chris had battled with the thoughts of taking his own life. There were occasions where people close to him would have to talk him down from the ledge, so to speak, and many close calls. A notable accident happened on January 20th of 2006, where Chris ingested a large amount of prescription medication and posted that he was going to spend his final moments at an internet cafe in Chile online. But thankfully, after noticing something was wrong with him, the staff at the cafe called emergency services, and he was quickly taken to the hospital to be treated. You can still find the whole thread on the Wayback Machine, and read through the interactions he was having as the drugs began to run their course. The final message he posted went like this: I overdosed in 1997 and spent weeks in intensive care on vitamin K because my blood would not clot. And I did severe liver damage, which is why I do not drink now. If you must know, I am feeling really impaired. And yes, time will tell what happens to me. I really have to get out of here. I cannot type. And want to vomit. Time to go hide. 3 days later, on January 23rd, Chris was found deceased in his Chilean apartment. He had put a plastic bag over his head and attached the tube from his stove into the mask, using the gas to end his life. And this is where things get a bit conspiratorial. Chris wasn't necessarily liked by everybody, and so when news of his passing began to spread, not everybody was buying it. Blame It on George made a great video about his hunt for the CR6 lost media, which I recommend watching if you'd like to learn more about the CR6 show. Blame It on George actually contacted our now deleted OP in this CR6 post, and it is during their search that they appear to stumble upon evidence that Chris might actually be alive. One of the issues is that Chilean records of Chris's death are hard to come by. Internet sleuths have attempted to pull up his death certificate by using his Chilean national ID number, which is available online, and putting it into the civil registry, only to get back this message. Dear user, the data you entered does not meet the requisites to issue this certificate, which according to this user on the r/Chile sub is the result you receive when you enter a living person's number. But even more interesting is the find that was made by the OP in Blame It on George's video. This person alleges that they were on Chris McKinstry's Wikipedia page, snooping around the edit history when they found what appeared to be some back and forth on whether or not Chris's body was extradited to his family in Canada. In particular, there was a single user whose wiki edit history was only edits to Chris's wiki page. This account here, with the username Kogolofino, it was created on January 24th, 2006, one day after Chris was reportedly found deceased. In Blame It on George's video, the OP alleges that they had managed to acquire this person's IP address, and when they traced it, it came back to Santiago, Chile, the same place that Chris was living at when he passed away. I attempted to do this myself, but the wiki profile has now been deleted, so I was not able to confirm if this is true. If this is true, then I could see why some people would think this is Chris. Assuming he did fake his own death, then confirmation that his body was extradited to his family would help solidify his story as opposed to not knowing where his body ended up. But as of the time of this recording, there is no mention of Chris's body anywhere on his Wikipedia page. The OP also points out something else. If you Google Chris McKinstry's name in the Google group messages, you can find this post from a person with Chris's name. The person speaks as though they are Chris, but in my opinion it seems as though this person is making fun of Chris, and not him posting after his alleged fake death. If we lean into the conspiracies for a little bit, I think he could have had reasons to fake his death. We know that at the very least he had lost around $1 million, and he allegedly owed cast members from the CR6 show. With that and MindPixel shutting down, it's reasonable to assume that he could have owed a lot of people money, and faking his death could have helped free him from that debt, as we've seen others attempt to do before. Throw in the missing death certificate and Wikipedia account, and things begin to look a bit fishy. Personally, I don't know what to believe. Chris undoubtedly struggled with his mental health, and that is not something to just discard, so let me know what you think down in the comments. Before we move on to the next topic, I would like to give a shout out to these two videos. If you'd like to learn more about Chris as well as his CR6 show, I highly recommend watching them. Both were a huge source of information for me, and each provide more details than I was able to fit into this segment. April 1851. About 90 miles off the coast of St. John's in Newfoundland, crew aboard the brig Renovation reportedly witnessed what they described as an iceberg estimated to be around 5 miles long and 30 to 40 feet high. Sitting in this iceberg were two ships, frozen stuck. The smaller of the two ships was placed higher up in the iceberg and appeared to be in good condition. but the larger ship looked to be on its side, and parts of it were practically destroyed. The sole passenger of the ship, a man named John Lynch, had urged the crew to go investigate, but unfortunately at the time, the captain of the ship, Captain Coward, was very sick and had a man named Robert Simpson take command. Despite Simpson going down to inform Captain Coward about the discovery, he did not receive permission to go investigate, and so the renovation sailed away, leaving the two ships behind. Captain Coward was quoted in an interview conducted by the Admiralty. When asked if he would have been able to identify any living beings on the frozen ships, Captain Coward said this: "If any living being had been moving about the decks, we could have easily have distinguished them with the glass. When I first saw the ships, I believed them to be the two Greenland abandoned, and such is my impression to this day. I was ill at the time, and the ship was surrounded by icebergs, and I was anxious to get away while the weather was clear. No mention was made at the time, nor did the idea enter my head that these ships might be Sir John Franklin's ships. This supposition was first mentioned before me next day, in convention with Mr. Lynch and the mate, Mr. Simpson. None of the crew who were with me at the time are now on board the Renovation, excepting 2 apprentices. The second mate, Andrew Bell, and the rest of the crew deserted at Quebec." Captain Coward mentioned Sir John Franklin's expedition, which consisted of the 2 ships, Erebus and Terror, that had gone missing a few years prior. At the time, there was a large reward for anybody who could find these ships, and it's reported that John Lynch had been aware of this, and that this is why he pressed the crew to go investigate. But as we can see, Captain Coward and his crew were not aware of this reward, and so did not press their sighting any further, but all of it was recorded in the ship's records. This was also reported to the Admiralty, but did not receive much attention until a letter written by John Lynch was published in the newspaper. Around the whole year after the initial sighting, and once the story had become popular, the report finally made its way to the Admiralty, who began investigating this. They sent officials to interview witnesses, where they found that everybody's stories lined up. They also found that a separate German ship had reported the sight as well. And in June of 1852, the Admiralty published a report titled Vessels in the North Atlantic. This is where they provided all of their investigation findings through various interviews and letters. After reading it, you can see the level of investigation as well as the process of the investigation as it develops. The Admiralty interviews crew members, and even people who were close to the crew, in order to determine if they could be trusted. After tracking down Robert Simpson, who was now the captain of another ship, the British Queen, he confirms that the crew had no idea that these ships could have been the Erebus and Terror. He also points out that the ships they spotted were painted black, and interestingly enough, the Terror and Erebus were also painted black on the outside. But despite their investigation, it does not appear that the Admiralty came to a solid conclusion. They seem to believe that the 2 ships in the ice were not the Erebus or the Terror, but instead likely merchant ships due to their large size. Later in 1859, a letter known as the Victory Point Note was discovered. On the edges of an Admiralty form was a handwritten message informing the reader that the 2 ships, Erebus and Terror, had been abandoned on April 22, 1848, after being stuck in ice since September 12, 1846. This timeline of events lines up too well with that of the Renovation sighting in 1851, only around 2 years after the Terror and Erebus were reportedly abandoned. So could the Admiralty have been wrong in their investigation? Eventually, in 2014 and 16, both the Erebus and Terror would be found in the Queen Maud Gulf, but from what I can tell, their discovery was not able to confirm or deny if these were the ships that the Renovation crew had spotted. If they were the ships, then they would have had to float a significant distance to end up where they were found, leaving us no closer to the answers of which ships it was that the Renovation brig saw. Perhaps had the Admiralty discovered the Victory Point Note earlier in their investigation, things could have gone a lot differently. No other ships have ever come as close as these, as being the ones identified as being stuck in the iceberg. But with the ocean's tendency to swallow up its victims, it's likely we will never find out. The Roswell incident is likely the most famous UFO sighting of all time. But there is one aspect of the story that seems to be forgotten about, or maybe even suppressed. The original incident happened in 1947, and as reported by the US military, was the result of a weather balloon crash. Initial reports from the newspaper at that time claimed that a flying disc had crashed down to Earth, but we're not focusing on the crash itself. We're focusing on a witness that ended up paying the ultimate price. Her name was Miriam Bush. According to reports, Miriam was the executive secretary to Chief Medical Officer Lieutenant Colonel Harold Warren in the Roswell Military Hospital. As the story goes, one day Miriam came home from work to tell her family about something she had seen that day. She was in a very happy mood and seemed excited. She went on to tell her family that her supervisor had asked her to go with him to a hospital room where she saw the bodies of several childlike beings. She described them as having very large heads, small bodies, and pale, the usual gray alien description. According to Miriam, the smell was terrible, and all of the beings except for one appeared to be dead. It's fair to assume that her family was shocked at hearing this, but things would get even stranger the next day when Miriam returned from work, only this time, her attitude was completely different. This time, Miriam appeared frightened. She told her family that they could never speak to anybody about what she had told them the night before, and as time would pass, she became increasingly paranoid. The paranoia ended up taking over Miriam's life. She became an alcoholic, a shut-in, and moved away to California, barely speaking to her family anymore. There are some reports that she believed she was being watched, and that listening devices were being placed to spy on her. All of this would come to a head in 1989, when Miriam checked herself into a hotel under her sister's name, and it is in this hotel that she was later found with a plastic bag tied over her head, deceased. According to her sister-in-law Pat Bush, who was interviewed in a documentary about Roswell witnesses, Miriam's body had shown signs of bruising, as if there was a struggle, but despite this, police would rule it as a suicide. I also read that during this time there were Roswell investigators who were looking for Miriam so that they could interview her about what she had seen, and that after hearing this, Miriam grew even more worried, either because these people were the ones she was hiding from the whole time, or because they might lead those people to her. The first thing I did to try to validate this story was of course look up Miriam's name, where I found this Ancestry census record from 1940. It lists a 14-year-old girl named Miriam Andrea Bush, who lived in Roswell. The only problem is that this census was 7 years before the crash, meaning that this Miriam would have been around 21 when she was the executive secretary of the hospital in the military base, something that is not impossible by any means. But if we're talking about a high-level military base, I would expect everybody to be a bit older or more seasoned. Again, not impossible, but something to consider. I also tried to find records of her superior, Lieutenant Colonel Harold Warren, but found nothing other than mentions of him in recounts of Miriam's story. And then there's the man named Glenn Dennis, who was a mortician that claimed he spoke to a nurse, which drew a picture of the beings on a napkin. The nurse has been theorized to have been Miriam, but Glenn's claims have been picked apart by many people who believe he was just lying to get attention. There is this YouTube channel that posted interviews from what appears to be a documentary about Roswell witnesses who were originally afraid to tell their stories. This is where I found Pat Bush's interview. In the descriptions of each of these videos is a link to the Sci-Fi Network website, where the show's information was located, but the original page is gone, even on the Wayback Machine. I looked all over the place to try to find any clips from this show but was unsuccessful. I did, however, find this blog post, which also links back to the now empty Sci-Fi page, so that at least helps validate this show's existence or promotion of the show. But I do wonder why Sci-Fi decided to completely erase this from their catalog. It's not even listed in the announced but unrealized section. From what I've gathered, I believe it was supposed to release somewhere around 2007, this being because the YouTube uploads and the blog where I found the image were both dated back to 2007. In her interview, Pat Bush speaks about Miriam and basically confirms what we know of the story so far. But she also claims that in the family's search for answers about Miriam's death, they investigated other witnesses, and many of them had also passed away due to mysterious circumstances. She states that she does not believe Miriam took her own life, and that something big was being covered up. The full interview will be linked in the source list if you would like to check it and the other 4 out. If we assume that all of this is real, and that Miriam was being monitored, then it would make sense that there are no records of her or other military personnel who witnessed these events and worked on the base. I've read many stories about how witnesses to extraterrestrial phenomenon become afraid, paranoid that people are now looking for them, watching them, and listening to everything. This would fit very well with what Miriam was going through. She had already spilled the beans, and could have been fearful of the consequences for telling her family. With so little information, this is where the story ends. But nowadays, the government seems to be more open with sharing information about events like these, so maybe in time, they might declassify more of the Roswell files and shed some light on Miriam's story. In 1934 Pirano, reports of a glowing woman started buzzing in a local hospital. The woman was a then 42-year-old Ana Monaro, and she had been at the hospital for an unrelated treatment. But after staff witnessed what they described as luminous emissions coming off of Ana, doctors wanted to look into this further. Thankfully, she agreed to be part of a study. And so a team of doctors, as well as a neuropsychiatrist and a physicist, began looking into Ana's glowing phenomenon. It was the physicist Giogondo Proti who wrote about the experiments in this article that was published in the Illustrated London News. According to the article, the study consisted of various tests, ranging from a routine medical examination, X-rays, recordings on supersensitive film, and the use of instruments capable of detecting and measuring electric currents. The researchers even built a Faraday cage, which is essentially a box that blocks out external electromagnetic fields to prevent the possibility of this being caused by some outside force. But it was on April 11th that the researchers recorded and measured Ana's mysterious glow. She had been recorded to glow for a little over 3 seconds, and this was captured on the supersensitive film. Here is an image of the actual film that was used to record Ana's glowing. You can see how the intensity of the glow slowly increases until it dies down and fades away. During the event, Ana's heart rate and breathing had also increased, as shown on this graph from before and after she began to glow. During the experiment, the researchers found that whether she was inside the Faraday cage or not, had practically no difference in her electroscopic charge read by the instruments. They also didn't find any evidence of this being a form of radiation being emitted off of her. But something interesting that they did notice was that Ana's glow would intensify during Lent and while she was in prayer. They theorized that her fasting during Lent could play a role in the glow due to the lack of food affecting her body chemistry. It was ultimately ruled that the cause of the glow must have been some sort of biochemical reaction, similar to how some organisms are able to produce a bioluminescent glow. The doctors examined her brain, heart, and the radiating power of her blood. They found that her heart and brain were relatively normal, but her blood had a higher level of radiating power than that of the average person. Because of this, it was theorized that when Ana would fast, whatever was in her blood that they believe could have been sulfides may have become excited, resulting in her glow under the right conditions of UV light, but ultimately no sure answer was found. While this might sound bizarre at first, I did manage to find this article on the Guardian website about how humans can produce bioluminescence as a result of the chemical reactions constantly going on inside of our bodies. It is just so dim that our eyes are unable to see it. If this is the case, then it could be that Ana's body was in some sort of overdrive at times. As we can see in the data, her heart and respiratory rates go up when the glow was reported to have occurred, but this is just my own speculation, and I am in no way a doctor or a scientist. I was unable to find any similar cases of another person glowing like Ana, which makes me wonder, could this have simply been a case of bioluminescence, or could the glow have possibly been the result of something else? Boriska Kipriyonovich was a Russian boy born on January 11, 1996. From a young age, his parents noticed that he was incredibly smart, and he would take the world by storm by claiming that he was actually from the planet Mars. Quoted in an interview done by Andrei Mikhailov, Boriska's mother would state this: "When Boris was just 1 year old, I started giving him letters, and guess what? At 1.5, he was able to read large newspaper print. It didn't take him long to get acquainted with colors and their shades. He began to paint that too." In a separate quote, "No one has ever taught him that," recalls Nadia, "but sometimes he would sit in a lotus position and start all these talks. He would talk about Mars, about planetary systems, distant civilizations. We couldn't believe our ears. Cosmos, never-ending stories of other worlds and the immense skies are like daily mantras for him since he was 2. And it was around the time that he turned 11 that word of the boy from Mars began to spread. While this might be something you would expect from a young child, it was the way that Boriska spoke about it. It seemed to not come from his imagination, but more as if he was speaking through his memories. He claimed he was a descendant of the Lemurian civilization, a civilization that used to live and thrive on Mars, but fell into catastrophe, forcing those who survived to migrate underground. He spoke of other civilizations as well, and even claimed that he would travel through the cosmos while piloting a spacecraft. And according to Boriska, there were more children like him being born, which he called the Special Ones. He believed that something was set to occur on planet Earth that would change everything and force humans to change their mentality. Another term given to these children is indigo children. The name was first coined in the 1970s by a woman named Nancy Ann Tappe. She was a parapsychologist, or someone who studies psychic phenomenon. Nancy claimed that in her studies she began to notice more children being born with indigo auras. These children were believed to have been gifted with high intelligence, and in some cases, even possessed extrasensory abilities. But much of this was sensationalized, and there isn't proof that these indigo children really exist. In his 2017 interview, Boriska came out to announce that his mission was to warn the Earth of the impending destruction that would be brought upon the planet as a result of a nuclear apocalypse. He stated that the Special Ones, or indigo children, were the results of Martian beings with supernatural abilities being born into human bodies. He also claimed that there would be a catastrophe in 2009 and another one in 2013. Interestingly enough, back in 2009, a 7.6 magnitude earthquake did take the lives of over 1,100 people in Indonesia. However, 2013 was a relatively tame year in terms of major disasters. He also predicted that the Earth's magnetic poles were soon going to flip. According to NASA, the Earth's magnetic poles flip in a cycle, and many scientists believe that the next cycle is long overdue. This isn't some hidden information, and of course Boriska could have found it, but what amazed people was the confidence that he spoke with. It was not as if he was just repeating something he read somewhere. It was as if he studied this his whole life and really knew what he was talking about, or at least sounded like it. Today, at the time of this recording, Boriska would be about 28 years old, and he does not appear to have any social media of any kind. According to some sources, though I wouldn't necessarily call them reliable, he was taken into custody by the Russian government and is living under their protection in a remote village. Whether this was to escape the media attention or aid the government is debated, but others say that his story was simply found to be a hoax, and that he stays off of the internet to avoid backlash. One thing is certain, and it is that since he was very young, he was very intelligent. But whether or not he really is a reborn Lemurian from the planet Mars remains a mystery. Rome is one of the most famous cities on the planet, known for its architecture, rich history, and art that continues to amaze us centuries later. But what if I told you that Rome may have a secret name? One that was so secret that mention of it could have gotten you executed. Such would allegedly be the case of a man named Quintus Valerius Soranus. In the year 82 BC, he was a Roman elite whose social circles contained that of scholars and politicians, but in that year, he was ordered to be executed for revealing the secret name of Rome. I tried to look for evidence of Rome even having a secret name to begin with, and as you might guess, there was little to no information. But I did manage to find a few possible explanations. The first one being that the secret name of Rome is Amor, or Roma backwards. This is because of the city's dedication to the Roman goddess of love, Venus, though I believe that this is a bit too simple to really be a name so secret that mentioning it would get you executed. There's also this translated version of the Roman book titled Natural History, written by a man named Pliny the Elder, who died back in 79 AD. In this section of one of the books, he mentions Quintus's execution. Rome itself, whose other name it is held to be a sin to utter, except at the ceremonies of the mysteries, and when Valerius Soranus divulged the secret religiously kept for the weal of the state, he soon paid the penalty. The ceremony of the mysteries is the part that I would like to focus on. Religion seems to play a big part in Rome's secret name, and one of their beliefs was that every city had a protective deity, a god or goddess. There is also a Roman military ritual called an evocatio that was performed in order to lure away a city's protective deity by calling upon its true name. This could have been what Quintus revealed, and if this was the belief at the time, then we could see why he was punished. But what was the name that he revealed? In this article, the author pieced together what they could in an effort to uncover this secret name, and it starts with an ancient tribe from southern Italy who go by the name Hirpini. Their lineage traces back to the founding of Rome, and according to their legends, it was a wolf that led them to Rome where they established their first settlements, and on Mount Socrates they had a temple where they would hold ritual firewalks. Here, priests would be tested by walking on hot coals. The author believes that Quintus was closely associated with the Hirpini, and that it was during one of these rituals that he had uttered the secret name. But in order to uncover this, we have to dive in deeper into the founding of Rome. This brings us to the legend of Romulus and Remus. They were born from the wife of King Amulius of Alba Longa. Because the two brothers could threaten the king's rule, he threw them into the Tiber River. It was here that the god Tiberinus saved them and eventually carried them back to the place that would soon become Rome. One of the most depicted parts of this story is that of the twins suckling from a she-wolf who had found them and took care of them until a shepherd found the boys and raised them as his own. In some ways, the wolf could be seen as the mother of Rome. Now let's go back to the Hirpini. Their name comes from the Oscan word hirpes, or wolf, and the priests who performed the firewalk were called the Hirpi Sorani, or the Wolves of Soranus. As I said earlier, the legend was that the Hirpini were led to their first settlements by a wolf, so we can see the significance of the wolf in the early founding of Rome. The Hirpi Sonari have also been called the cult of the wolf. Given this information, the author concludes that the secret name of Rome must have been Hirpa, or some variant of their wolf goddess. They also believe that Quintus must have been one of these priests, which is how he had knowledge of their secret wolf goddess name, eventually going on to speak it out loud during one of these rituals, resulting in his execution. But there is one final possibility to what the secret name is that I saw in a post from a now deleted Redditor. The blog post linked here cites a lot of antiquated scholarship. Nobody knows the secret name of Rome because it never had one. At least not until people in the late Republic began speculating about archaic and obsolete ceremonies and literary fabrications that passed for history. You'll notice that the passages cited link a secret name of Rome to the idea of evocatio, the religious ceremony whereby the Romans supposedly lured the deity of an enemy city to defect to them. By that logic, the legalistic Roman concludes, if the enemy doesn't know the real name of our city, then they can't convince our deity to defect. Far from being a usual practice, there are practically no solid historical examples of evocatio from early Rome. You have Lily's legendary origin story in the capture of Veii, and the anachronistic revival of this ceremony, supposedly prior to the destruction of Carthage. Another thing, the attested formula for the ritual begins, whether god or goddess. In other words, the name of the god is irrelevant. Even at Veii, the Romans supposedly summoned Juno Regina, not some eponymous civic god. If Hannibal wanted to evoke the god of Rome, he undoubtedly targeted Jupiter Optimus Maximus, not Roma, let alone secret Roma. You can read what we know about Valerius Sonatus at Wiki, including the giant mess caused by Vado's weird claim that he was killed for uttering the secret name, and not because he made enemies during Sulla's proscription like everyone else. In sum, the secret name of Rome and supposedly routine evocatio are two of those antiquarian puzzles that seemed very important to excitable positivist scholars in the 19th century, but hardly hold up to serious scrutiny. Maybe some folks at the end of the Republic hit on the idea to explain other things, and if they presumably believed in it, I guess that they made it real. But remember, we're not talking about what people in the age of Cicirio thought was archaic and authentic, not whatever really happened centuries later, for which we have no reliable sources. And I believe that this commenter has a really good point. Sulla's proscriptions were a campaign by the Roman proconsul and later dictator Lucius Cornelius Sulla, in which he eliminated his enemies in the aftermath of his victory in the Civil War of 83 through 82 BC. This timeline lines up very well with Quintus's execution, and if he was one of these priests in this wolf cult, then we could see why Sulla would want to get rid of him. Perhaps the utterance of the secret name was merely an excuse to get rid of a political opponent, but as the commenter said, without reliable historical sources, it's almost impossible to confirm. If there was a secret name, I believe that some variant of a wolf goddess would make more sense than Amor, given the wolf's symbolism in the founding of Rome. Still, it all seems as though we are grasping at straws, but I guess that's why they call it a secret. That's all for this video. If you made it this far, leave a like, and as always, thanks for watching. We start off with an image taken in June of 2001 by a woman named Andrea. It appears as though she had initially taken a picture of her dog, but when she later examined the photo, she saw something in the background that terrified her. Quoted in an archived ghoststudy.com webpage, Andrea states, "When I saw this picture for the first time, I had a feeling of utter fear. The picture was taken at night in a barely lit room with a Canon ELPH Advantix camera with 200 speed film and a flash. Take a look at the image in the window. It still gives me chills, and I was afraid to go into the backyard at night for months. Friends look at it in disbelief, and others, for lack of a better term, freak out. I'm one of those that still freaks out when looking at it. It resembles some sort of demon." In the center, we see Andrea's dog, but at the top left corner of the image, we can see what appears to be some kind of creature staring into the window. I tried to think of a normal explanation for this, such as trees or bushes, but looking at the enlarged version, it does not resemble any kind of plant. The creature looks like it has a large mouth with sharp teeth, and maybe even an eye staring back at us. It reminds me of a Lovecraftian-style monster, similar to Cthulhu. One commenter would state that maybe it was a reflection from the couch pattern. I will admit that the picture really gave me the heebie-jeebies at first, but the more I looked at it, the sillier I felt. If you look at the right corner of the picture, you can see something is also on the bed. Then look at the reflection of the dog in the window of the original picture. The image is appearing in the same spot as the material to the right of the picture. Maybe a quilt or a pile of laundry? Not so scary anymore. This is a good theory, but we can't see what's on the bed, only a small sliver of something off to the right. I also tried to reverse image search the picture to see if I could find a better quality version, but was unable to do so. Commenters on this post seem to believe that this is the result of something from the OP's bed, or possibly in their room reflecting onto the window, while others believe this could be some form of demonic or supernatural entity. Looking at the thing is very creepy, but unfortunately, there is no more information to go off of, so it's left to our interpretation. Li Ching Yuen was a Chinese herbalist who passed away on May 6, 1933. It's believed that he was fully literate as a young child, and, in his early teens, had dedicated his life to gathering and studying herbs in the Chinese mountains. By the time he was in his 50s, he had become a tactical and topographical advisor in the army of General Yu Zhongqi. But the problem here is that Yu Zhongqi was a Chinese general in the late 1600s and mid 1700s. And if you do the math of when Li passed away, that would mean that he had lived to be over 250 years old. Interestingly, not much is known about when exactly Li was born, but there are accounts that state he joined the Chinese army at the age of 71 in 1748, which would mean he would have had to have been born in around 1677, making him 256 years old at the time of his death in 1933. According to Google, the oldest recorded living person was a French woman named Jeanne Calment, who lived to be 122 years old. And scrolling through Wikipedia's list of verified oldest people, there is no mention of Ching Yuen. His story seems to be more myth than historical record. Allegedly, there are reports of documents congratulating him on his 200th birthday from the Chinese government, but I was not able to find them. In a quote from a 1933 Time magazine article, Li would give his secret to a long life. Keep a quiet heart, sit like a tortoise, walk sprightly like a pigeon, and sleep like a dog. His longevity is partially credited to his diet and use of medicinal herbs, and there's even a book published by Li and his disciple titled The Immortal, True Accounts of the 250-year-old man, Li Ching Yuen. The book allegedly provides historical accounts of Li's life, as well as information on how he was able to live for so long, using breathing techniques, herbal medicines, and exercising the mind through meditation and the practice of martial arts. I say allegedly because I have not personally read the book, but it does exist and can be purchased by anybody looking to learn the secrets contained inside. As for the legitimacy of the claims that Li actually lives to be that old, there's not much to either confirm or deny it, other than the date of his death. This is likely why he's not officially listed as the longest person to have ever lived. I also believe that if all of this was true, then the method in which he achieved this would be studied intensely, and our own lifespans would be longer as a result, making me feel like this is more of a myth, perhaps even fabricated in order to aid in book sales. Dorothy Eady was a famous Egyptologist not only known for her work in Egypt, but also for her claims of being the reincarnation of an Egyptian woman from the time of the ruler Seti I. It all started around 1907, when Dorothy fell down a flight of stairs at the age of 3, knocking her unconscious. Her parents, Reuben and Caroline Eady, were both very worried, but thankfully after some time, Dorothy did manage to regain her consciousness. Except now, Dorothy began to speak differently and insisted that she be returned home. This confused her parents, because seemingly, Dorothy was not talking about the home that she shared with them, but they chalked it up to her confusion being a result of the fall. Not long after, Dorothy's parents took her to the British Museum, and when she saw the Egyptian exhibit, Dorothy began to say that this was the home she was speaking of. She even asked where all of the trees and gardens had gone. Normally, this wouldn't be too alarming coming from a young child because they have such vivid imaginations, and usually grow out of phases like this. But this was not the case for Dorothy. She still spoke differently to how she did before the fall, and now after seeing the Egyptian Museum, it seemed as though her beliefs had grown stronger than ever. This would go on to last for the entirety of her life. During her teens, Dorothy attended an all-girls Christian school, but was banned from attending Sunday Mass for saying that Christianity reminded her of old religion, as well as comparing Christianity to Egyptian paganism. Those around her began to get worried about her mental state, so much so that her parents sent her to multiple sanatoriums, all of which had little to no effect on her. At around the age of 16, Dorothy began to claim that the spirit of Seti I, who she also called Ho-Ra, had been visiting her at night to tell her stories from her previous life, all of which she began to write down in hieroglyphic text. According to Ho-Ra, Dorothy was the daughter of an Egyptian soldier named Ben Reshit, meaning Harp of Joy. Her mother was a vegetable seller who passed away when she was 3 years old. But because her father could not afford to raise her, she was sent to the temple of Qom el Sultan in Abydos, Egypt, where she began studying to become a priestess. When she turned 12 years old, the high priests at the temple gave her the choice to either leave the temple and live in the outside world, or stay and become a consecrated virgin of the Egyptian god Isis. She decided to stay. For context, a consecrated virgin is a woman who has been consecrated by the church or temple that remains a virgin and dedicates her life to serving the church. But after 2 years in service, the now 14-year-old Egyptian girl met the pharaoh, Seti I. The pair became lovers, and the girl later discovered that she was pregnant. After going to the priests to tell them about what had happened, she was told that as a consecrated virgin, this was punishable by death. But that wasn't all, because if this was the child of Seti I, then this could be seen as a huge scandal for the pharaoh. Tragically, the young girl opted to take her own life before going to trial, in an effort to not dishonor the pharaoh. Moving into early adulthood, Dorothy landed a job working at an Egyptian magazine, and also met her husband, Imam Abdel Meguid. The two relocated to Cairo and had a son who they named Seti. She also began to go by Seti, which meant Mother of Seti in Arabic, and it was clear that still, even decades after her fall, her beliefs continued to grow, so much so that her marriage began to strain, leading to a divorce. Following the divorce, Dorothy and her son stayed in Cairo, and she began to work at the Egyptian National Department of Antiquities. She was the first woman to work there, and this job granted her the ability to study and work with Egyptian scholars. The locals in Cairo had a somewhat complicated relationship with Dorothy. On one hand, they respected her, because she was so knowledgeable in the old traditions, but on the other, they feared her, because the idea of her actually being a reincarnated spirit from ancient times made them uneasy. At age 52, Dorothy moved to Abydos, the city in which she claims to have lived in her past life, to work at an excavation site, because it was one of Seti's temples that Dorothy believed she had actually lived in. Upon learning about this, the chief inspector of the site decided to test Dorothy, and reportedly took her into a dark room inside of the temple. The room was said to have had ancient paintings on the walls that had not yet been published to the public. He asked her to identify the locations of the paintings in the darkness using her reincarnated memories, and to his astonishment, she was able to do this very easily, when she should not have had any prior knowledge to the artwork or its locations. Dorothy would go on to help archaeologists extensively in the field, using her knowledge to help navigate ancient ruins and translate hieroglyphic texts, until she retired in 1964. Unfortunately, due to her beliefs, neither Christian or Muslim cemeteries would accept her when she passed away at the age of 77 in 1981. She had even constructed a tomb for herself near her home, but the local health authorities did not allow her to be put to rest there. She was eventually buried in a grave in the desert of a Coptic cemetery, but at the very least, she was laid to rest in the country she considered her true home. I will say that despite the pushback she received, Dorothy stayed true to herself for the entirety of her life, up until the very end, and while it is easy to dismiss her claims, the familiarity she displayed when working at the excavation sites and the knowledge she brought forward are undeniable. Perhaps she made a few lucky guesses. Perhaps she was knowledgeable from a lifetime of research. Or maybe she knew what she knew because she had actually lived it. In the town of Zaragoza, Spain in the 1930s, lived the Palazon family, who shared an apartment on what was at the time known as Gascon Gotor Street, but their time living there was all but peaceful. It was in September of 1934 that the family began claiming that they were hearing a voice coming from their stove. The voice sounded male and would scream, laugh, and of course talk to them. Eventually this activity got so bad that they invited neighbors over to see if they could hear the voice as well, and to their surprise, they did. The family lived on the second floor of the apartment building, and soon, the whole building was aware of the creepy voice, but the voice did not appear to happen anywhere except for the Palazon family's unit. There was a lot of speculation, and many of the residents began to believe that the voice was coming from a duende, or in English, an elf/goblin. But this is not a small, friendly elf like those of Santa Claus. In Latin folklore, elves are mischievous beings who are sometimes said to steal children. After a while, the rumor spread so much that the locals would wait outside the apartment unit hoping to witness the activity for themselves. But the one person who heard it the most was the Palazon family's maid, Pascuala Alcocer. Eventually, the duende rumor grew so large that the local police had to get involved, though there is some debate on whether this was done because of real concern or in an effort to calm the public down. Regardless of the reason, the police began their investigation. The first thing that was done was, of course, to search every room in the building, as well as the chimney that all of the stoves in the building connected to. This provided no answers and no evidence of anybody hiding, or there even being any hiding spots to make the voice appear in the Palazon family's unit. But one interesting thing did happen. While conducting the investigations, it's alleged that one of the investigators suggested that the chimney opening be measured. Immediately, the voice manifested itself, responding to this investigator by saying, "You need not trouble. The diameter is just 6 inches." To everyone's surprise, the voice was correct. The entire apartment building was evacuated, and a 30-yard perimeter was established, ensuring that whoever was making the voice had either no way into the building or out. A priest, doctors, and psychologists were all brought in, but suddenly, the voice stopped speaking. The silence lasted for 2 whole days, and by now, the local magistrate was ready to end this spectacle. He felt that this was causing unrest in the locals, as well as wasting resources, so he decided to end the investigation and called it an anomaly, hoping that everybody would just move on. But only a few days after the police left, the voice reappeared, this time saying, "Cowards, cowards, cowards. Here I am." The Palazon family had had enough and moved away from the city, but the rumors began to spread again, forcing the police to return, and now they were the ones being harassed by the voice. The voice would constantly say that it was coming for them, though nothing or anybody would ever appear. The apartment became somewhat of a paranormal tourist hotspot, and people would try to conduct their own investigations, one of which included installing microphones in an attempt to record the voice for a radio show. But this time, the panic forced the governor of Zaragoza to get involved, who made a public statement asking everybody to calm down and to help identify who the prankster making the voice was. Less than a week later, the governor gave an official statement in which they claimed that the voice had come from the young Palazon family's maid. They even went as far as to say that she had done the voice through an unconscious ventriloquism. Pascuala, of course, denied these rumors, stating that she had no memory of doing this, but one of the investigators stated that they had seen this occur, calling it a psychic phenomenon produced only in certain circumstances. And just like that, the investigation was closed, and the government opted to move on with other matters. The public now believed that it was Pascuala, but the authorities had no evidence to charge her with any crime. Following this, she moved away, and that was pretty much that. In 1977, the building was demolished and rebuilt, now named Edificio Duende, which translates to Goblin Building. But I do have a couple of things that I would like to point out. The first was the reported diameter of the chimney, because in all of the accounts that I've seen, they state that the voice said it was 6 inches, which cannot be correct, since in Spain they used the metric system. This could be the result of centimeters being lost in translation, but I just wanted to point this out. Secondly, it's reported that even after the family moved away, the voice remained, but the police still put the blame on Pascuala. Obviously, she didn't have to leave town with the family since she just worked for them, but they were the ones who employed her. So if she had moved, then she would have had to have no reason to be in the building with the police, even if she was somehow unconsciously throwing her voice while she was working there. I don't see how she would be allowed into an area currently being investigated, especially if she was unconscious, making the government claims even more suspicious. I don't blame them for wanting to calm the public down, though this seems more like they just wanted to end the panic by giving a half-hearted explanation. To this day, the truth of who or what made the voice remains unclear, but I guess that's what makes this a mystery. In December of 1945, the Belva mine in 4 Mile, Kentucky was the site of a mine explosion that took the lives of many miners. Fortunately, a small group of 6 were able to barricade themselves and survive long enough to be rescued, but some of the reports on what happened while they were in the mine have sparked a lot of discussion. Here we have a map of the mine provided by the CDC's report on the incident. The portal in the lower section is the entrance, and we can see at the very top the origin of the explosion very deep within the mine. The explosion itself was the result of a blown-out shot, which is when the explosives used to break the coal in the mine go off without breaking the coal itself, and instead exploding in the air. This can be due to improper placement of the charge, and the result can be very dangerous. In the Belva mine case, the charge ignited the methane and coal dust that was in the air, spreading quickly and engulfing half of the mine, as seen in the map. The flames, however, are not necessarily the most dangerous part of the crisis, because since there is not proper airflow in a mine, when an uncontrolled fire erupts, then the carbon monoxide inside of the tunnels grows to deadly levels. This is known as afterdamp, and it's completely invisible. During the initial crisis, a group of 9 miners found themselves in the heart of the explosion, but somehow managed to barricade themselves in one of the sections in the mine, using brattice curtains and wood to shield themselves from the carbon monoxide and flames. The miners were stuck inside for 54 hours, during which they kept their faces close to the floor from fear of inhaling the carbon monoxide. During the first 48 hours, attempts were made at finding an exit route that resulted in 2 of the miners collapsing in the afterdamp. And sadly, when the rescue did manage to get to them, one of the miners had already passed away. Afterwards, 2 more miners lost their lives as a direct result of the event, one 2 days later, and the other after a few months. Now you may be wondering, what's so strange about this? It sounds just like a regular mining incident, and you would be correct. But this is just the information listed on the official reports. Allegedly, there is more to the story. According to this newspaper clipping, some of the miners reported that while they were barricaded inside of the mine, a door had appeared, where a man described to be dressed as a lumberjack came out to inform them that everything was going to be okay and that they were going to be saved. Inside of the door was described to be a well-lit room, but the man who came out of the door went back into it, disappearing and leaving the miners trapped yet again. There are theories that this man could have come from an underground base of some sort operating within the mine, but this is a bit conspiratorial if you ask me. This newspaper clipping was the only source that I could find that mentions anything about this occurring. Personally, I believe this was most likely the newspaper trying to sensationalize the event, or possibly some kind of hallucination brought on by the elevated carbon monoxide levels. The idea of an underground base inside of a mine just doesn't make sense to me. Inside of a mountain is one thing, but in a mine where there are constant demolitions taking place, you would assume that someone would have already stumbled upon one of these hidden chambers. Ultimately, I don't think this is much of a mystery, but at least it makes for a good story. Brittany Murphy, an actress notably known for her role in the 1995 movie Clueless, as well as being the voice of Luann on King of the Hill, passed away at the age of 32 on December 20th, 2009. Throughout her career, Brittany landed many high-profile roles and was very successful from an early age. But the film industry can be a very dark place, especially for women, and unfortunately, Brittany would not be an exception. At one point, it's even reported that Brittany was told that she was not enough to land a lead role by producers. Things like this, coupled with her own personal struggles, led to her career declining. This clearly took a toll on her mentally and physically, and eventually, she lost so much weight that people began to speculate on whether or not she was using heavy drugs, or potentially had an eating disorder. All of this would seemingly reach its peak when she married a man named Simon Monjack in 2007. When Brittany passed away only 2 years after marrying Simon, his behavior would lead many to believe that he might have had something to do with her death. But the story gets weirder. For now, back to their relationship. Simon was a screenwriter, and he and Brittany met on the set of The White Hotel. The pair's relationship was concerning to many of Brittany's friends as Simon isolated her from everybody, making the only way to contact her through him. But despite the pleas from those around her, Brittany would not listen, and eventually, Simon moved in with Brittany and her mother. Soon after, he assumed control of her finances, and Brittany's behavior became even more concerning. In a documentary about Brittany's death filmed by HBO, even Simon's friends and colleagues accredited Brittany's drastic appearance changes to the abuse and isolation brought onto her by Simon. He would ultimately be the reason that her career came to an abrupt end in November of 2009, when Simon showed up to Brittany's movie shoot for The Caller, very intoxicated. Producers wanted him to stay back because he was so possessive over her, but he would not let her out of his sight. This led to the producers firing Brittany, making this the last film she would ever work on, quoted from an article on the NBC New York website. Bizarre doesn't begin to describe the behavior on set, the source claimed. It's her husband who is Satan, and he drags her to the dark side. And even after all the horrible things she and her evil dude did, everyone is devastated. Only 2 months after being fired from the set, Brittany would collapse in her home. The paramedics were called to help her, but unfortunately, by the time they got there was nothing that they could do.
A hospital spokeswoman has confirmed tonight that the Hollywood actress Brittany Murphy has died at the age of 32. The Los Angeles Fire Department told the website TMZ that an emergency call was made from a home in Los Angeles at 8 o'clock this morning after the actress went into full cardiac arrest.
An autopsy was conducted and determined that the cause of death was pneumonia with severe iron deficiency and multiple drug intoxication. The drugs, however, were all legal and were likely used to treat a cold or infection according to the coroners. Following her death, Brittany's mother and Simon began making appearances in the media and even did a photo shoot together, which is where many began to question what had actually happened to Brittany. In any suspicious death, the spouse is always the first suspect. But here's the strange part. Only 6 months after Brittany passed away, Simon would also collapse and pass away inside of the same home that he and Brittany shared. Because this was so odd, and with it being relatively soon to Brittany's death, mold was suspected of being the cause of death for both of the victims. Initially, Brittany's mother denied these claims, but would later change her mind and file a lawsuit against the builders of the home. Brittany's father would then attempt to do another autopsy and began claiming that Brittany could have been poisoned. Her mother would deny these accusations and would soon begin to live in seclusion, but she would release an open letter speaking about the situation and attempting to clear the air. In it, she denies all of Brittany's father's claims and explains how he was never in her life to begin with, as he was serving 12 years in jail, furthermore claiming that the sudden interest in Brittany came in an effort to gain money and fame in hopes of making a documentary and writing a book. Her mother would speak about the pain she's felt in losing her daughter and son-in-law, and closed off the letter with this: "She was my baby, and we stood together throughout Brittany's life. Now, I must stand up for her again. It is time for those who really knew and loved her to put those who want to exploit her on notice. Your lies will no longer be tolerated, and as long as I live, will continue to be exposed." There was some suspicion that her mother could have had something to do with the death of Brittany and Simon, with money being the motivation. However, by the time Simon had passed away, there was little money left, because Simon had spent practically all of Brittany's $3 million fortune in the less than 3 years they were together, though there isn't evidence to prove whether or not Sharon was aware of this. I personally don't know if I believe that her mother could have had something to do with all of this, but I would like to say that in Brittany's case, the assumption was that her already bad health contributed largely to her untimely death. But Simon wasn't going through what Brittany was health-wise. His health was not the best, but still the fact that they both collapsed and passed away within a year of each other is strange to say the least. If this was the result of mold poisoning, then I would assume that her mother would have gotten sick as well, seeing as how she lived in the house, but this did not appear to be the case. Ultimately, the autopsies and investigations reported that there was no evidence of foul play, so could it all have just been a strange coincidence? Or could this have been the result of something sinister? Keeping with the theme of strange deaths comes the story of Christopher Case. Chris was originally from Richmond, Virginia, where he started his career as a successful radio DJ. By the age of 35, in 1991, he had worked his way up in the music industry and landed an executive position for the Muzak Holdings Company. But shortly after returning from a trip to San Francisco in April of 1991, he began to act strange, and not long after, Chris was found deceased, fully clothed, sitting in his bathtub facing the wall with his face leaning against it. What was strange was that when police began investigating Chris's apartment, They discovered that surrounding the bathtub were multiple candles and crucifixes. Religious music was also reported to be playing in many of the rooms in his home, and after an autopsy was performed, it was ruled that his death was the result of myocarditis, a condition where the muscles in the heart become inflamed, affecting its ability to pump blood, which in many cases can result in heart failure. This can be caused by certain infections and pre-existing conditions, but it can also just happen for seemingly no reason at all, or at least no known reason. You see, Chris was pretty healthy at 35, he regularly went to the gym, and according to his friends, was well-rounded mentally, so for him to suddenly experience heart failure was very strange to those around him. But there is a lot more to the story, and in order to get the full picture of what might have happened to Chris, we have to go back to his trip to San Francisco. Allegedly, while in San Francisco, Chris had met a woman in his free time, and the two had begun to somewhat hit it off. The problem was that she was much older than him, and to Chris, this was a deal breaker. It was after rejecting her advances that the woman began to get angry with him and told him that she was a witch. She then said that she was going to put a curse on him and that it would cause his death in 1 week. At first, Chris was not too concerned about this. He didn't believe much in the supernatural and figured that she was just mad at him and saying things that would scare him. He would tell his friend Sammy about what had happened over the phone. She too believed that this was nothing to worry about, but in the coming days, Chris would begin to change his tune. Already back home on April 14th, and 2 days after the original phone call with Sammy, Chris would call her again. But this time, he sounded distressed and told her that he was not able to get any sleep because he kept hearing whispers in his apartment. He was also seeing shadowy figures and felt as if he was being watched. The activity would begin to escalate, and another 2 days later, Chris called Sammy again, this time informing her that he had been strangled in his sleep by some invisible force, and that it was strong enough to have lifted him up from his bed. Normally, this could be written off as sleep paralysis, but Chris would state that there was even blood on his bed sheets the following morning. This was when he took it upon himself to try and figure out what exactly was going on. That day, it's reported that he had gone to a religious bookstore where he purchased multiple crucifixes and books, informing the store manager that he was attempting to ward off evil witchcraft. When he got home, he set up candles, the crucifixes, salt lines, and played religious music throughout his apartment. There aren't any accounts on what exactly happened on that night, but it's stated that something had scared Chris so badly that he had to leave and checked into a hotel. Worried and already knowing that Chris was going through something, Sammy attempted to do a welfare check on his apartment, but unfortunately when they got there, it was locked and they could not enter. Sammy did get a voicemail from Chris the next day on April 17th. However, her relief was cut short. In the voicemail, Chris sounded calm, despite having spent the whole week stressed out and afraid. He then told Sammy that whatever evil forces that were trying to get him had almost succeeded the night before, but that this was his final day alive. The very next day, the police went back to his apartment and found his body surrounded by candles and crucifixes. Now, with the added contexts of Chris's supposed curse, his sudden heart failure seems a lot more suspicious. As I said earlier, Chris was healthy and of sound mind before he encountered the supposed witch woman, so for him to suddenly believe that he was being tormented by some evil force was way out of character to those who knew him. Something must have really scared him to the point that he went out and purchased multiple crucifixes and spread salt around his apartment. There are, however, a few theories on what could have possibly happened to him. The first was his health. Chris was healthy and young, but myocarditis can happen and does happen to young men who seemingly have no health problems. It is rare, but it does happen. Furthermore, it's believed that the use of some vitamins and supplements can increase the risk of myocarditis, and this could have been the case with Chris. The second theory is that due to his paranoia, Chris may have actually scared himself to death. This too is very rare, but is also possible. Some believe that Chris may have been going through some sort of psychosis, causing him to hallucinate what he believed he was seeing. The stress and terror of it could have been too much, and this could have caused his heart to suddenly fail. And of course, the final theory, which is that the witch's curse was real, but there is no evidence to prove this. In the end, Chris's case remains an enigma, with no cause ever being determined for what could have led to his myocarditis. No foul play was reported in the investigations either, which makes the whole thing even stranger. Regardless of whether it was all just a sudden occurrence or the work of some curse, Chris lost his life way too soon, and while we'll likely never know what actually happened to him, we can only tell his story and hope that he is now resting in peace. This section is about the Family International, originally known as the Children of God cult, a controversial religious movement that started in the mid to late 60s. Now, before we get into it, I would like to give you a warning that the topics we will be discussing in this section are incredibly disturbing, so if you would like to skip ahead, I fully understand, and a timestamp to the next section will be provided on screen. Like many other cult groups, the controversies mostly stemmed from the group's sexual activities, using sex to lure in new members, sharing their partners amongst each other, and the involvement of minors. The Family International did implement rules in 1987 to protect said minors and stop using sex to recruit members in an effort to distance themselves from the controversies, but amongst the adults, partner sharing continued. An eventual raid by multiple government agencies occurred in the 90s, who were concerned about the safety of the children in the group, but thankfully, after a thorough investigation, they found no cases of abuse. Since then, the group has continued to grow, with members from over 70 countries worldwide, but many of their former members continue to speak out against them. This section of the iceberg is not so much about the cult itself, but more about the media that they produced and distributed internally amongst the group members. It was on the r/tip of my tongue subreddit that a former member of the Family International asked for help in identifying a kids show. The user, NoNameGal9999, would upload this post on May 15, 2021. Strange, low-budget religious kids show, possibly late 80s to early or mid 90s. Creepy religious kids show made by a cult I escaped from. I know the title sounds clickbaity, but I assure you, every word of it is true, and what I'm describing is real. I just know it is. Some background: the cult in question is called the Family International, or TFI. I grew up in Huntington Beach, which funnily enough is where the culture started. I was born into it with my parents still remaining members to this day, their start dates for the cult as of now being unknown. What I know for a fact, the show followed a sheep, possibly named something biblical, as they encountered problems. The show was in the style of Sesame Street, with puppets and actors with small animated segments. Standard kids show affairs, right? Well, the problems encountered dove into disturbing subject matter. One segment I recall had the sheep talking to a little boy who had said he wanted to serve Jesus in all the ways he could, with the sheep saying the little boy should give his body to the church, with an animated Jesus standing next to what I recall being children wearing little clothing. The show, from what I remember, appeared to have been made in the 80s judging by the camera quality, but I grew up in the 90s and saw these at only 4 years old, so that puts us at 1994 for my earliest recollection of it. Some of the kids within our group were born in the 80s, and they had seen these too, so that puts a possible start date as late as 1985 to 1989, but I could be wrong. The show came on VHS, and we had hundreds stored away on church property. If these prove the existence of hundreds of episodes, or just means there are multiple copies of the same episode, is unknown. My theories: information is likely scarce for two reasons. Either it's been scrubbed to save reputation, or it was produced by the cult with no release outside, so obviously no documentation. I also believe that the actress who voiced the sheep was a gospel singer who sang in numerous videos for the cult dating back to the 70s, which also leads me to believe it may have had musical segments. Children within the cult have also been used for the production as well. I intend to update as new information is found, and I thank anyone who takes the time to read and help to search. The content that the OP described is very creepy to say the least. It's as if the cult was using this media to program the members' children. And if the OP's theories about it potentially dating back to the 80s and early 90s are correct, then that would put the show's production to before the rules protecting children in the group were implemented. A user named Moon is Planet would link a show called Treasure Attic that featured a puppet sheep and fits the description of what the OP described. You can actually find an episode of the show on YouTube.
Now, this is a story all about a little lamb that liked to wander off on her own. One day, it got her into a lot of trouble. Are you ready?
Let's go!
Okay, watch this.
While it is creepy, the OP would state that this was not the show they had remembered in 2 updates to the post. The show Treasure Attic got brought up a lot, and while similar, it's not what I'm referring to. I'm led to believe multiple shows were produced and a production studio even being found tied to the cult could be the key to finding this. The more overt nature of it could have been why there's almost no mention of it. It's also likely that this was made by a different studio and just bought by the TFI. That would explain the differing from the other videos as well as the lack of info. Another show that was suggested was The Lovitz, which can also be found on YouTube.
The Lovitz, those happy loving puppets with songs of love and songs of joy.
Both of these shows are tied to the Family International, and I believe that the use of puppets was in part due to the low budget in producing this media, but the OP would go on to say that this was not the show they remembered. One user, however, links the website xfamily.org that archives and documents media produced by the Family International. The OP states that none of these videos he remembers, but if we take a look at some of the content, we can find some very disturbing things. There's the Loving Jesus album 4 that features the track Let's Make Love, and I don't think I need to describe it in further detail. There's Flirty Fishing in Osaka that details the family's practice of using sex to recruit new members, and many more videos, skits, and low-budget shows, most of which featuring children. When you add in the context of what was going on during this time period, it takes on a much darker and sinister tone. A link to the archive is in the source list if you would like to go through it yourself, but I warn you, it is very disturbing. Unfortunately, the OP was not any closer to finding the show that they had seen as a kid, but in a final update to the post, they would inform us that they had contacted another former member and asked them about it. So around 2 days ago, I had attempted to contact the next member asking if they recalled this too, and while they said they didn't, they did state that they recall similar shows with very disturbing material. Seeing as how this was in the 80s and 90s, it's very likely that every form of media that was produced physically and internally distributed to the members of the cult and their families. By providing the members with self-produced media, the family is able to keep them inside of the cult bubble, alienating them from the outside world, and also programming its members from a very young age. One user would comment this: TFI scrubbed all of the child abuse shit pretty thoroughly after the Ricky Rodriguez incident, if I remember correctly, but good luck finding it. There seems to be a lot of confusion on where and under what circumstances the man behind the puppet show propaganda died. For context, Ricky Rodriguez was a former member of the family. In fact, he was looked at as their messiah and worshipped by members of the cult. Despite this, however, Ricky left the group at the age of 21 and later took the life of his abusers as well as his own in 2005. I won't go into details, but prior to this, Ricky recorded himself and detailed his history inside of the cult as well as why he felt he needed to take matters into his own hands for not only himself, but for the other victims of the group as well. This brought more attention to the family, but by then, they had distanced themselves from the past allegations and managed to keep growing. Since the family has already laid the groundwork for destroying or at least hiding the previous media and past association with their history of abuse, it's likely that there are many more forms of media that will never come to light. This, unfortunately, means that the OP probably won't find the creepy kids show that they were looking for, but given the accounts from other former members, I think it's safe to assume that at some point it did exist. Maybe it's better that the videos were destroyed, but sadly, the memories of them as well as the things that occurred to the members will live on in their memories. The royal family is no stranger to controversy, but we're not talking about Prince Andrew's association with Jeffrey Epstein or King Charles' somewhat disturbing portrait. We're going to be discussing the late Prince Phillips' fascination with UFOs and how he almost allegedly had a meeting with an extraterrestrial. Reportedly, Prince Philip's interest in UFOs began when he stumbled upon a classified report in the Royal Archives. The report was written by his uncle, Lord Mountbatten, but it wasn't until his death in 1979 that the report came to light. In the report, Lord Mountbatten wrote about an encounter that had occurred on his estate in the town of Romsey. Reportedly, a strange craft had flown above the estate and landed on the grounds, after which, a being wearing strange clothes and a helmet came out of the craft. This was all witnessed by a man named Fred Briggs, who was a trusted bricklayer for the royal family. After seeing this being, Briggs was reportedly knocked down to the ground by some unseen force, after which he would go on to write a statement about what he had seen. The following was Lord Mountbatten's response. The attached statement was dictated by Mr. Briggs to Mr. Travis on the morning of the 23rd of February in 1955 at my request. My own electrician, Heath, reported his conversation, and I subsequently interviewed Mr. Briggs with my wife and young daughter, and as a result of his account, Heath and I accompanied him to the place from which he saw the flying saucer. We followed the marks of his bicycle in the snow very easily, and exactly at the spot which he described, the tracks came to an end, and footmarks appeared beside it. Next to the footmarks were the marks of a body having fallen in the snow, and then the marks of a bicycle having been picked up again, there being a clear gap of 3 feet between where the front wheel marks originally ended and then started again. The rear wheel marks were continuous but blurred. From then on, the bicycle tracks led back to the drive. The bicycle tracks absolutely confirm Mr. Briggs' story, so far as his own movements are concerned. He, Heath, and I searched the area over the spot where the flying saucer was estimated to have been, but candidly, we could see no unusual signs. The snow at the bottom of the meadow had melted much more than it had at the top, and it would have been difficult to see any marks. This statement has been dictated in the presence of Heath and Mr. Briggs, and Heath and I have carefully read Mr. Briggs' statement, and we both attest that this is the exact story which he told us. Mr. Briggs was still dazed when I first saw him, and was worried that no one would believe his story. Indeed, he made a point of saying that he had never believed in flying saucer stories before, and had been absolutely amazed at what he had seen. He did not give me the impression of being a sort of man who would be subject to hallucinations, or would in any way invent such a story. I am sure from the sincere way he gave his account that he himself is completely convinced of the truth of his own statement. He has offered to swear to the truth of this statement on oath on the Bible if needed, but I saw no point in making him do this. Signed, Lord Mountbatten. This is what is believed to have sparked Prince Philip's interest, but being a part of the royal family and the husband of the Queen herself meant that Prince Philip couldn't just openly speak about UFOs. That could have been seen negatively by the public, and as a result, the prince had to put some distance between himself and his interests. He did this by having his equerry, a man named Peter Horsley, serve as a proxy. Horsley would keep him informed of any UFO activity and find him potential witnesses as well. Horsley would even go on to write a book about his time doing this. It was titled Sounds from Another Room. This would all seemingly come to a head in 1954, when Horsley allegedly met with an extraterrestrial being who wanted to arrange a meeting with Prince Philip. The being informed Horsley that humans were destroying the planet, that they wanted to help, and that they believed Prince Philip could help them, but despite his interest, the meeting did not occur. This was because it was unclear if this being was actually an extraterrestrial or a Russian spy trying to take advantage of the prince's curiosity. A documentary that came out in 2024 called The King of UFOs goes into the royal family's history on the subject, as well as their interest in the paranormal. It is very interesting because, since they are royals, things like the paranormal and extraterrestrials are not spoken of due to it being bad for their image, but there seems to be a lot of history in the royal family that suggests they have always kept an open mind to such things. Prince Philip also had a collection of books on UFOs in his own personal library, and to me, the idea that one of the planet's elites was so invested in researching the subject is kind of funny, but also having the authority to read classified documents, or at least have more access than 99% of the world, makes me believe that perhaps he may have known something that the public does not. The sun is the center of our galaxy. It brings us warmth, and without it, life on Earth would not be possible. But what if the sun was also responsible for influencing major historical events? Allow me to explain. The sun, as you already know, is a giant ball of fire fueled by the nuclear reactions in its core that turn helium into hydrogen. This process causes particles inside of the sun to constantly move, creating a magnetic field that is much stronger than the Earth's and much, much larger. Because of how strong these forces can be, sometimes dark spots can be seen on the surface of the sun. We call these sunspots. Around these sunspots is also where solar flares occur. These can send geomagnetic storms in all directions, including towards Earth. We can see evidence of these through the phenomenon known as the aurora borealis, or in other terms, the northern lights. We've known about sunspots from as early on as the 1600s, but it wasn't until 1843 that scientists began to notice a pattern in the average amount of sunspots that were identified. We call this the solar cycle, which occurs over an 11-year period, during which solar activity ramps up, then slows down, leading to the number of sunspots to either increase or decrease. But something else that scientists began to notice was that the timeline of these solar cycles also lined up strangely with the timeline of historical events. We can see in this graph here in an abstract written by Adam Michalek from the International Astronomical Union. On the left is the average Wolf number, which is just a fancy way of saying the number of sunspots recorded, and on the bottom is the timeline of human history. We can see that as solar activity increases, historical events appear to occur as well. In particular, many revolutions seem to correlate with solar activity, almost as if the solar activity amps up everybody on the planet. There are many scientists who have looked into a potential link, but this is all still theory. And since each cycle takes around 11 years to reset, actual long-term observations would have to span over decades to get a definite answer. We only have 25 documented cycles, with us currently in the 25th. Our current cycle began in 2019 and is set to reach its peak in 2025, and I find this very interesting. With everything currently going on around the world, it is very odd how the solar cycle is also reaching its peak. There have been some scientists who believe strong magnetic fields can potentially affect our brainwaves, and while we have some tools that are able to measure this, we do not have the same level of power that is generated from the sun, or truly know how these galactic level forces can affect the minds of every living thing on the planet. As I said before, there just isn't enough data to make a concrete answer, but the data that we do have seems to hint that there could be a link between solar activity and historical events. At the time of this recording, it's currently 2024 and almost 2025, so hopefully, if the activity is reaching its peak, things die down rather quickly, so that maybe things around the world can begin to calm down again. But I guess we'll just have to wait and see. That's all for this video. Leave a like if you made it this far, and as always, thanks for watching.